Hey guys, tonight we're slipping quietly into the flickering candlelight of old courtrooms. Those heavy wooden chambers where love, betrayal, and absurdity often collided in slow motion. You can almost hear the scrape of quills and the faint rustle of parchment as bishops and judges tried to decide whether two people were, in fact, still married, or had never really been married at all. It's a strange world to wander through where a whispered accusation could turn a wedding into a scandal, and the difference between "till death do us part" and "oops, never mind" depended on how well you could keep a straight face. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're watching from somewhere unexpected, say a rainy bus stop at 2 a.m., or a cozy bed with one arm stuck awkwardly under your pillow, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where this sleepy little community drifts in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year could be 1421 or maybe 1613, dates blur when you're half dreaming. But the smell of tallow candles and human anxiety doesn't change much. You find yourself seated in a creaky wooden pew, the air thick with incense and gossip. Before you, a couple stands trembling as the clerk reads out their names. Their marriage, as it turns out, might not have been one at all. Annulment was not divorce. That's the first thing people forget. Divorce meant admitting a marriage existed and failed. Annulment meant declaring it never truly existed in the first place. It's a bit like a medieval quadruple for romance. And while today that might sound like an emotional technicality, back then it was a matter of eternal salvation and social ruin. You watch as a bishop clears his throat, leaning forward with an expression that could curdle milk. Was there true consent, he asks? Was the union consummated? Those words carry weight, the kind that can determine inheritance, legitimacy, and whether an heir is royal or just awkwardly spare. Historians still argue whether annulment courts were merciful or merciless. Some say they protected women trapped in impossible marriages. Others insist they were tools for the powerful to escape inconvenient vows. Either way, the stories they left behind are part courtroom drama, part dark comedy. Take the 12th century case of a noblewoman named Constance, who insisted her husband had vanished on the wedding night. Not romantically, but literally. He had fled through a window. Whether he feared marriage or the bedsheets, no one knows. But in the church's eyes, that single night of absence nullified everything. If the husband never came to bed, the record reads dryly, the union was void. You can imagine the smirk on the scribe's face as he inked those words. The courtrooms themselves were almost theatrical. Picture rows of men in long robes, the scent of damp wool and candle smoke clinging to the air. There's a hum of murmurs, interrupted by the slap of papers and the occasional cough. Someone in the back might even be selling sweetmeats because human nature doesn't change. Scandal always draws snacks. Sometimes these hearings were quiet and sad. A woman pleading that her marriage was forced upon her when she was 13. Other times they bordered on slapstick. One man, accused of marrying under false pretenses, argued that his wife had bewitched him with enchanted wine. The bishop sighed, probably wishing for stronger wine himself, and then declared that if magic had indeed stolen the man's consent, the marriage was null. You can feel the absurdity curling through the candle smoke, an entire system built on trying to measure the immeasurable: love, intention, purity, and performance. And yet, for all the strangeness, there was order in it. The church, for all its eccentricities, believed marriage was sacred. To annul, it meant dissecting every fibre of that holiness. Witnesses were summoned. Neighbours, servants, even midwives asked questions like, Did they share a bed? Did anyone hear laughter or tears that night? It sounds invasive because it was. But in those candlelit chambers, gossip became evidence, and silence became guilt. You glance toward the back of the hall where an elderly clerk dips his quill, noting every detail in looping Latin. His ink-stained fingers tremble slightly as he writes down phrases that would later puzzle scholars for centuries. Maritus fugit, uxor timuit, spiritus malignus interfuit. The husband fled, the wife feared, an evil spirit interfered. It reads less like law and more like folklore. A strange mix of tragedy and comedy runs beneath it all. There's the couple who claim their marriage never truly began because they'd exchanged vows by accident while play-acting at a festival. The bishop raised an eyebrow, possibly wondering what kind of play involved vows and witnesses. Then there were those who argued about mistaken identity, brides who discovered their new husbands were not who they claimed to be, or men who realized too late that their bride's dowry had been dramatically exaggerated. You lean back a little, imagining the soundscape of that time, the scratch of quills, the faint drip of wax, the muffled laughter of a scribe when someone's testimony went spectacularly off script. Annulment hearings weren't just legal proceedings. They were morality plays for an audience that half believed love itself was a matter for clerics to decode. Of course, power lurked behind many of these cases. When commoners sought annulment, they faced humiliation and costs they could barely afford. When nobles sought it, entire nations held their breath. The famous example, Henry VIII trying to erase his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, would eventually split the church itself. But before that, there were countless smaller tragedies, smaller absurdities where ordinary people just wanted a second chance to love or to escape a mistake blessed by too much wine and too little clarity. Historians still debate whether most annulments were honest or manipulative. Did people truly believe their marriages were invalid, or were they simply creative with excuses? One surviving letter from 1503 complains bitterly that men invent miracles to be rid of women. Another, from a jilted husband, insists the church wipes away vows as one wipes a table. You can almost sympathize with both sides. Picture the lonely priest trying to interpret divine will through gossip and half-truths. Picture the terrified bride clutching her veil, praying for release. Picture the groom sweating through his tunic, wishing the floor would open beneath him. It's oddly comforting, in a sleepy sort of way, to know that even in the supposedly solemn centuries of faith and formality, people were just as messy as we are now. They fell in love, panicked, lied, begged, and sometimes laughed at the absurdity of it all. And as the last candle gutters in that medieval courtroom, you feel the glow dimming, replaced by the soft rhythm of parchment turning and the faint creak of benches. Somewhere, a clerk yawns. A bell tolls the evening hour, and the couple at the centre of it all waits, holding their breath, to find out if their marriage ever really happened. The judge's voice is slow, deliberate. "The union," he says, "is annulled." The woman exhales, the man bows, and history quietly adds another footnote to its long list of strange, sad, and occasionally hilarious love stories. The candles fade, the air cools, and you feel yourself drifting further into that echoing hall, half amused, half comforted, knowing that even in the most bizarre moments of human romance, someone was always there, taking notes. The flicker of that last candle fades, but you're still seated there, on the same creaky bench, watching another couple shuffle nervously to the front of the hall. The bishop clears his throat again, and a quill scratches softly in the background. You can smell beeswax, damp wood, and a hint of something awkward in the air, because tonight's trial isn't about love, betrayal, or inheritance. It's about consummation. Yes, that word. The one whispered in medieval corridors with all the tension of a thunderstorm. You probably won't survive this level of awkwardness, but we'll get through it together. Back then, a marriage wasn't truly a marriage until it was made one flesh. That phrase came straight from Scripture, but to the courts it meant proof, tangible proof. And when proof was missing, well, out came the lawyers, clerics, and sometimes the curious neighbours. You can imagine the scene: the bride, pale as milk, clutching her shawl, the husband fidgeting like he's about to be tested on something he definitely didn't study for. The notaries lean forward with interest. Someone coughs discreetly. The judge begins. Was the marriage consummated? In modern terms, this would be the part where everyone politely pretends not to hear. But in the 13th century, this was serious business. A marriage that wasn't consummated could be annulled, wiped clean from record as though the vows had never been spoken. One of the strangest cases on record comes from France in 1659. A noblewoman claimed her husband was incapable of the act. The court, being the compassionate place that it was, ordered an examination, not by doctors but by priests and matrons. The poor man was made to demonstrate his situation before witnesses under candlelight. And yes, that's every bit as horrifying as it sounds. Historians still argue whether such trials were genuine attempts at fairness or just excuses for humiliation. Some say they were compassionate, offering escape to women trapped with cruel or neglectful men. Others say they were voyeuristic theatre disguised as justice. Either way, the records survive, written in delicate Latin that somehow makes the whole ordeal sound worse. There were even rules for these tests. A man might be given a few weeks to prove his capacity. Sometimes sympathetic physicians offered him herbal tonics, ginseng, ambergris, or ground rhinoceros horn. Others prescribed prayers, because clearly nothing fixes awkwardness faster than a group prayer about your virility. If after all this the marriage was still unfulfilled, the woman could request an annulment. And yes, the verdict would sometimes include chillingly clinical lines like, "The union was attempted but not accomplished." You can almost hear the medieval scribe sighing as he dipped his pen. Yet not all cases were so grim. In some instances, annulment over non-consummation became a kind of secret blessing. Picture a young woman forced into marriage at 14, her husband 20 years older. When he failed to fulfill his duty, the court offered her freedom under the soft banner of divine mercy. She could walk away, dignity mostly intact. And sometimes the tables turned. There's a record from Bologna in the late 1500s of a husband who accused his wife of refusing him for months. When questioned, she calmly replied, "I thought marriage meant peace, not torment." The courtroom reportedly erupted into laughter, and the bishop dismissed the case on the spot. You can almost see the smirk in the transcript. Annulment wasn't always about cruelty or shame. It was, in its own bizarre way, a mirror of how societies defined real love. The Church saw intimacy as sacred, a symbol of divine unity. So when it didn't happen, they assumed something spiritual was missing too. Some scholars believe this obsession came from the medieval fixation on purity and perfection. Marriage wasn't just a contract, it was a theological experiment. The couple was supposed to reflect heaven's harmony right down to their bedroom. So, when that harmony failed to manifest, the entire universe, in the Church's eyes, tilted slightly out of alignment. You can almost feel the weight of that expectation. Two nervous humans standing under the scrutiny of heaven, being asked to prove something as delicate and private as passion. And if they failed, their love, no matter how real it felt, was erased. The evidence, oddly enough, wasn't always physical. Sometimes witnesses swore that the couple slept apart. Other times they testified that the bride appeared too joyful after the wedding night, which apparently was suspicious. A historian once wrote that medieval judges believed a truly consummated bride should look modest and subdued. Try not to roll your eyes too loudly. One famous English case from 1527 involved a man named Robert who confessed that his wife terrified him with her eyes. The bishop took this seriously. After all, if terror prevented consummation, divine law might consider it null. You can picture Robert squirming under oath, mumbling something about those dreadful eyes, while his wife stood nearby, probably radiating silent triumph. And while most annulments stayed confined to these dimly lit courts, some sparked gossip across entire kingdoms. Royals, nobles, and popes treated consummation like political ammunition. Henry VIII famously used it as one of his excuses to dissolve his marriage to Anne of Cleves, claiming she was no maid in person or in face. Translation: he wasn't attracted to her, so he declared the marriage unconsummated. The poor woman, pragmatic and witty, agreed instantly, earning herself a castle, a pension, and the title of King's beloved sister. Arguably one of the smartest breakups in history. Historians still debate whether Henry ever even tried. But what mattered was the appearance of chastity, the illusion that divine law and royal convenience could hold hands and look respectable doing it. It's strange, isn't it, how something so intimate became public theatre. The idea that love could be proven or disproven through evidence sheets and testimonies. You glance around the fading courtroom again. The crowd murmurs. The clerk yawns. The husband in question stands red-faced, the wife serene. The bishop nods gravely and declares, "The marriage is null." You can almost hear the collective exhale. Not relief exactly, just exhaustion. Another candle burns low, the scent of wax filling the air. And as you drift further into the quiet of that room, you realize how much of history's absurdity comes from our endless attempt to define love by rules and rituals. To measure it, contain it, prove it. But love, as the centuries keep reminding us, refuses to fit inside parchment margins. The next case waits in the corner, another couple whispering nervously, another quill poised to judge, and as the candle gutters once more, the story of holy unions grows stranger still. The next parchment slides across the table, and you lean forward as the clerk adjusts his spectacles. The case number is inked carefully, but the handwriting wobbles, as if the quill itself hesitated over the words, because this one isn't about purity or consent, it's about proof. And proof, in the medieval world, could mean anything, from a priest's hunch to the results of what they called an impotence trial. Yes, that was a real thing. If your marriage was unconsummated, you didn't just say it, you had to prove it. And proving it meant witnesses, medical experts, and an alarming willingness to turn the human body into a court exhibit. It was the 1500s version of a very public performance review. You watch the poor husband shuffle to the front. The air feels thick with discomfort. His lawyer mumbles something about inability to perform the necessary duty. The bishop raises one eyebrow as though he's heard this excuse 1,000 times before. Historians still argue whether these trials were truly about justice or just a mix of humiliation and dark entertainment. Because what happened next was part comedy, part tragedy, and entirely bizarre. The court would summon 3 men and 3 women to act as examiners, respectable citizens, usually older, sometimes physicians, sometimes not. They were tasked with verifying, and I quote, the presence or absence of virile faculty. In simpler terms, does everything work? You can almost hear the collective sigh of mortification echo through time. In one famous 17th century French case, the nobleman Jacques de Langeais was accused by his wife of incurable impotence. He protested that he was perfectly capable, just not with her. The court, unsatisfied, ordered a full investigation. The 6 examiners gathered in a small, candle-lit chamber. Jacques was instructed to demonstrate the truth of his claim. His wife, naturally, was not present, though her testimony would later describe the event as both comedic and tragic. Afterward, the witnesses solemnly declared that Jacques had failed to convince them. That might have been the end of it, but Jacques appealed to a higher court. He insisted on a second trial. This time, his defense brought witnesses who testified that they had personally observed his capacities in other circumstances. You may insert your own horrified pause here. The court eventually granted the annulment, and Jacques went on to remarry, a quiet victory that likely left every scribe in Paris shaking his head. You have to wonder how people kept a straight face during those proceedings. Picture a room full of powdered wigs, solemnly nodding while taking notes on a man's, test results. There's something absurdly human about it, the collision of bureaucracy and biology under the banner of divine law. And yet these impotence trials were treated with absolute seriousness. Failure to perform wasn't just embarrassing, it could destroy your social standing, your fortune, even your family's honor. Marriage in those days wasn't primarily about romance. It was about alliances, heirs, and keeping property in the right hands. If you couldn't produce heirs, you couldn't produce legitimacy. So the Church, in its earnest attempt to keep order, created rules that sometimes bordered on farce. One court even ordered couples to live together for 3 nights under observation to see whether the necessary act would occur. Guards stood outside the door. Servants were instructed to listen for evidence of harmony. Imagine that as your honeymoon. Some historians claim these trials were born out of genuine compassion to free spouses from cruel or impossible situations. Others argue they reflected a deep-seated obsession with control. After all, the Church tried to govern not only souls but bodies. To sanctify love meant to supervise it. And for every tragic case, there was one that veered straight into slapstick. In Bologna, around 1560, a man claimed that his wife's frightful noises during the night rendered him incapable of fulfilling his duties. The bishop, with magnificent patience, asked him to describe these noises. The man said they resemble the bellowing of oxen and the screaming of owls. The court clerk reportedly laughed so hard that ink spilled across the record. Whether the marriage was annulled or the man merely exiled for being dramatic, the archives don't say. Sometimes the accused would turn to cures. Medieval medicine had a whole pharmacy of strange remedies for impotence: crushed emeralds, deer antler powder, roasted sparrow hearts, and a particularly unfortunate recipe involving bear gall and honey. If you ever wondered where the phrase snake oil salesman came from, this was its spiritual ancestor. And then there were the love potions, banned by the Church, but secretly exchanged in marketplaces everywhere. Dried rose petals, goat fat, a few drops of blood. Because apparently romance has always involved questionable ingredients. Of course, none of this helped the poor souls standing before the bishop. For them, every trembling confession became ink on parchment, a permanent record of their most private failures. You can feel the heavy silence of that moment when the clerk dips his quill and writes, "Incapable of consummation, marriage annulled." But here's the strange part. In rare cases, annulment brought relief, even joy. There's a record from Naples where a young bride, freed from a violent husband through an impotence trial, celebrated by donating her wedding veil to the local convent. The note pinned to it read simply, "God is kind." That single sentence says everything. In a world where the Church controlled almost every aspect of life, an annulment could feel like a miracle disguised as paperwork. Still, you can't help but sense the absurdity. The idea that love, desire, or even biology could be reduced to a legal checklist, that a man's pride, or a woman's peace, could depend on the testimony of strangers taking notes by candlelight. Historians still debate whether these trials reflected compassion or cruelty. Perhaps both. They were windows into a society that valued purity so highly it sometimes forgot about privacy. As you sit there, the courtroom around you hums again with low voices. Another husband fidgets. Another wife stares at the floor. The clerk coughs and flips the page. The candle burns lower, painting the walls with gold and shadow. And somewhere, just beyond the laughter and the sighs, you sense the quiet truth that's followed humanity for centuries, that when love and law try to share a bed, someone always ends up sleeping on the floor. The next case begins before you even realize the last one has ended. The flicker of candles dances on the courtroom's cold stone walls, and parchment rustles softly as another couple is ushered forward. You lean in, half expecting another scandal about missing passion or questionable potions, but this one feels different. There's a peculiar tension in the air, something solemn and strangely divine. The clerk clears his throat and begins to read in Latin, his voice echoing slightly. This union is challenged on grounds of religious error. That phrase, though it sounds harmless enough, once had the power to unravel lives. Back in the medieval and Renaissance centuries, marriage wasn't just a social or legal contract, it was a spiritual one too. You didn't just vow to your spouse, you vowed before God through the church. And if that sacred equation was disturbed, say, if one of the partners turned out to be a member of the clergy or had taken holy vows, then the marriage was never valid to begin with. Holy, but not holy enough. You glance toward the accused, a pale man in plain robes. He looks more monk than husband, and perhaps that's the problem. His wife, wrapped in dark velvet, clutches her rosary but refuses to look at him. The bishop asks, "Did you take vows before this marriage?" The man hesitates too long, and the air fills with quiet knowing. Historians still argue whether these religious error annulments were acts of mercy or just institutional housekeeping. Some say they protected the sanctity of spiritual service. Others say they were convenient loopholes for families who regretted alliances. But in that room, under those flickering candles, it feels less like theology and more like tragedy. You see, monks and nuns weren't supposed to marry at all. Their first marriage, metaphorically, was to God. So, when one slipped out of the monastery and into matrimony, it wasn't seen as romantic rebellion, it was seen as adultery against heaven. One of the strangest examples comes from 14th century Florence. A woman named Isabetta fell in love with a man who introduced himself as a merchant from Pisa. They married in secret, sharing vows whispered in a candlelit chapel. But months later, during a visit from travelling friars, she discovered her merchant was actually Brother Pietro, a Franciscan who had vanished from his monastery. The court annulled the marriage, of course, but not before Isabetta's story spread through every piazza and marketplace. People said she'd been seduced by a ghost of God. The church was ruthless about these errors. A man or woman who had once taken holy vows, no matter how long ago, was considered bound forever. Even if they left the monastery, even if they'd been released from duty, even if they had no memory of it, their souls were technically unavailable for human love. You couldn't compete with divine paperwork. There were even elaborate investigations to determine whether someone's vows counted. A few confused souls found themselves tangled in theological red tape. Did you take vows before a legitimate superior? Did you kneel at the right altar? Did the candle burn until the end of the blessing? One missed gesture, one wrong word, could mean freedom or damnation. And while the Church maintained these laws with pious precision, ordinary people often used them for more practical reasons. A family might claim religious error if their daughter's marriage turned sour or politically inconvenient. In one Spanish case from the 1500s, a nobleman's wife argued that he'd secretly been a monk years before they wed. The husband swore it wasn't true, but his enemies found witnesses who remembered seeing him tonsured, the small bald patch shaved on a monk's head. Whether or not it was real, the bishop declared the evidence convincing. The marriage was erased. Imagine that, losing your marriage not because of infidelity or cruelty, but because someone once thought you looked like a monk. Sometimes, though, the accused fought back. In a 17th century English case, a man named Thomas Green was accused by his wife of having been ordained secretly in youth. He demanded to see the church register, insisting, "If I were wed to God, I should like to see the certificate." The bishop, unimpressed, said, "The Lord keeps his own records." The courtroom burst into laughter. It's moments like these where history almost feels self-aware, where bureaucracy, belief, and humour meet in one surreal knot. But underneath the laughter was real pain. For those involved, an annulment didn't just dissolve a marriage, it erased part of their identity. You were no longer a husband or wife. You were a sinner, a fraud, an accident of faith. And your children, if there were any, were suddenly illegitimate in the eyes of the Church. The line between divine justice and cruelty blurred. You can almost feel the weight pressing down on this dim hall. The wife weeps quietly into her rosary. The husband stares at the flagstones, his silence heavier than denial. The bishop whispers with his clerk quill, scratching on parchment. Then, with the soft solemnity of a bell tolling, he announces the union is dissolved, the husband shall return to the cloister. The woman nods once, as though she expected this. The man bows his head and walks away, his sandals whispering against the floor. The courtroom exhales. Outside, the wind rattles the stained glass windows, scattering coloured light across the walls. It feels almost like confession, like the world itself is trying to absolve them both. Historians still debate whether such rulings were justice or tragedy. Perhaps both. Maybe love, in that time, was always balanced on the edge of sanctity and sin. And maybe, just maybe, the only ones who truly understood it were the ones who lost it. The clerk files away the parchment. The next case is called. You lean back, eyes half closed, as the court hums with quiet dread. If the last few cases have taught you anything, it's that medieval love was fragile, bound by oaths weighed by scripture, and sometimes destroyed by the tiniest crack in theology. But the strangest is yet to come, because next you'll meet the bride whose missing teeth almost erased her wedding vows. The court feels quieter now, though not calmer. You hear the shuffle of feet, the creak of benches, the low murmur of gossip slipping between veils and velvet sleeves. Someone lights another candle, its flame dancing weakly in the draught from a high, arched window. The next parchment is unfurled with deliberate slowness, as if even the clerk is reluctant to read what's written there. This marriage, he begins, is contested on the grounds of physical defect. You shift in your seat. There's an uncomfortable pause before the crowd begins to murmur again. Physical defect, two words capable of destroying a person's future, in an age where beauty wasn't just admired, it was legally binding. The woman at the centre of this case stands trembling, her head bowed. Her veil hides most of her face, but you can see her hands clasped tightly around the edge of her shawl. Her husband, or perhaps soon-to-be former husband, stands beside her, chin raised, trying to look solemn but failing to hide his smugness. "State your reason," the bishop says, his tone weary. The man clears his throat. She deceived me, your grace. I was promised a healthy bride, but upon lifting her veil on our wedding night, I discovered... He hesitates for dramatic effect, because of course he does. She was missing several teeth. A gasp ripples through the courtroom. The bishop blinks twice, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. Somewhere in the back, a clerk nearly snorts into his inkwell. You have to remind yourself that in medieval and Renaissance Europe, this wasn't just vanity, it was law. A marriage contract could be annulled if one party concealed a material defect, anything that could impede conjugal affection or duty. And yes, missing teeth were on that list. So were warts, scars, crooked spines, and even bad breath. Historians still argue whether these rules were meant to protect marriage or to make a mockery of it, because in reality they gave people an elegant excuse to back out of unions they simply regretted. There's a story from 15th century Florence about a man named Ludovico who demanded an annulment after discovering his wife had lost a finger in a childhood accident. He claimed the missing finger made her unfit for the mutual exchange of affection. The court dismissed him, writing that a single finger does not render a woman incomplete. You can almost hear the dry sarcasm in the judge's Latin. But others weren't so lucky. In Paris, a tailor annulled his marriage after discovering his wife had concealed a limp. The bishop ruled in his favor, citing that the defect was material to the deception. The woman, humiliated, returned to her father's home, where, according to one account, she became a nun, her faith perhaps less a calling than an escape. The belief behind all this was that physical perfection mirrored spiritual harmony. If you were missing a tooth, a limb, or even a sense like hearing, some believed it was evidence of divine disfavor, or a sign that the marriage was not blessed. Love, they said, must be whole, because God's creation was whole. But humans, being humans, took this theology and twisted it into absurdity. There's a particularly grim case from England in 1624, where a man claimed his wife had one eye of differing colour, and thus concealed a deformity. He argued this was fraud, as her family had promised a fair and symmetrical bride. The court debated for 3 months before finally declaring that heterochromia, 2 different eye colours, was unusual but not ungodly. The man still left her, but the paperwork didn't go his way. And then there's the infamous case of the missing teeth itself, a true story, or at least a famous one, repeated across Europe. A wealthy merchant married a woman from a respected family only to discover on their wedding night that she had removed a set of false teeth. Enraged, he stormed into the streets shouting that he had been sold a ruin. The court sided with him, declaring that a deception of such magnitude defiled the sacrament. Her name, sadly, was not recorded. Only his complaint survived, neatly inked on parchment, preserved for centuries like an insect in amber. You can almost see her now standing before the bishop, her face half hidden by lace, her dignity trembling but not broken. She doesn't speak. Perhaps she's forbidden to. The verdict is already written. The marriage, the bishop says softly, is nullified. The husband bows, satisfied. The woman nods once and leaves the hall in silence. It's hard not to feel the chill that lingers after her steps fade away. The crowd shifts uneasily, perhaps realizing that any of them could be next. Any freckle, any scar, any crooked smile could make a marriage invalid. Historians still debate whether this obsession with bodily perfection came from religion or from Renaissance vanity, likely both. The Church taught that the body reflected the soul, while Renaissance culture worshipped proportion and beauty as divine order. Between those two ideals, real people, messy, imperfect, human, were crushed. You imagine the endless stream of cases that must have followed. A bride with a crooked nose, a groom with a limp, a widow remarried but suddenly accused of concealing age. Each story etched onto parchment, each judgment pretending to defend holiness but mostly defending ego. And yet every now and then compassion slipped through. There's one record from 1482 that describes a husband who refused to annul his marriage even after discovering his wife had lost her sight. When the bishop asked why, he said simply, "She cannot see me, but I see her, and that is enough." The clerk, moved, noted that the man wept and kissed her hand. It's one of the few moments in the archives that feels like genuine love managed to survive the paperwork. You sit back as the courtroom's murmurs fade. The candles flicker, their flames wavering like fragile promises. The bishop's voice drones on about the next case, but your mind lingers on the woman with the missing teeth, on the way truth and cruelty sometimes shared the same sentence. The law, it seems, was as fragile as the bodies it judged, and love, real love, had to slip through the cracks just to breathe. The last echoes of that case fade into silence, replaced by the slow, uneasy creak of wooden benches as the next pair approaches. The candles seem to flicker a little lower now, their light bending like tired witnesses to yet another impossible story. You can almost sense it, the air shifting, the curiosity of the crowd sharpening, because this one isn't about bodies or beauty. It's about bewitchment, yes. Tonight's proceedings concern love spells, demons, and the supernatural, where hearts were tangled not by choice, but by enchantment. The clerk clears his throat dramatically, reading from the parchment. The petitioner claims her husband's consent was taken by sorcery and devilish influence. You can feel half the courtroom lean forward. Somewhere, a priest makes the sign of the cross. The bishop looks unimpressed, as though he's heard this all before, but knows he has to pretend it's serious. The woman, young, dark-haired, her eyes fierce despite the fear, steps forward. Her voice trembles just enough to make the silence around her heavier. "He was bound to me by witchcraft, Your Grace. I confess it. I placed a charm beneath his pillow before our wedding." A gasp ripples through the crowd. Somewhere, a candle pops. Even the scribe pauses mid-sentence to look up. Historians still argue whether these confessions were sincere or strategic. Some women, cornered in loveless marriages, claimed sorcery as a way to undo what they'd once done willingly. Others, accused by jealous neighbors or suspicious husbands, confessed out of fear because witchcraft could mean death, but annulment only meant disgrace. And disgrace, at least, left you breathing. The woman continues, voice steady now. "It was not love, Your Grace. It was a binding. I took a lock of his hair, mixed it with my tears, and hid it in his pillow. He came to me after that, as though drawn by the wind." The bishop exhales through his nose. "And you now repent?" She nods. The husband, red-faced and humiliated, blurts out, "She bewitched me. I would not have married her otherwise. My mind was not my own." It's equal parts tragedy and farce, really, a theatre of superstition dressed up as justice. But in those centuries, bewitchment was a legitimate reason for annulment. If one spouse could prove they'd been spiritually coerced, their marriage was considered invalid. The devil apparently made an excellent scapegoat. There's a record from 1486, Burgundy of all places, where a man claimed his wife had lured him to the altar using a charm made from owl feathers and rose thorns. The court annulled the marriage on the spot. The bishop reportedly remarked, "The devil works in many forms, even floral." You can't tell whether he was serious or just exhausted. Another case from Poland tells of a miller who swore his bride's eyes glowed red in candlelight, and that he had felt unnatural heat during their vows, His wife retorted that he was simply embarrassed because he'd fainted during the ceremony. You can almost hear the courtroom snickering at that one. The bishop wisely called for a week of fasting and declared the marriage null in the interest of peace. Behind the laughter, though, lies something darker. In an age terrified of invisible forces, bewitchment wasn't just a story, it was a weapon. A nobleman might accuse his wife of sorcery to escape an unwanted union. A wife might claim demonic influence to protect herself from charges of adultery. The court didn't always burn witches, but it certainly erased them, one annulment at a time. The church walked a fine line. It didn't want to encourage superstition, yet it couldn't deny the devil's theoretical power. So bishops would often phrase rulings carefully. If indeed the union was bound by unnatural means, it is void in the eyes of God. Translation: we don't know what happened, but we'd rather not argue with demons about it. You can picture the atmosphere, half courtroom, half seance. Priests muttering Latin prayers, judges sniffing holy water before taking notes, witnesses crossing themselves just to be safe. One Italian chronicler wrote of a couple who accused each other of witchcraft simultaneously. The husband said his wife's stew had stolen his strength. The wife said his breath had darkened her dreams. The bishop threw up his hands and annulled the marriage, declaring that both parties seem under enchantment, possibly of their own making. That line has aged remarkably well. Historians still debate whether any of these trials reflected real belief or social theatre. Some modern scholars suggest that bewitchment was simply medieval shorthand for regret, a way to explain why love had soured or why reason had vanished in the heat of desire. And really, haven't we all blamed something supernatural for our bad decisions at least once? Still, it wasn't all absurd. For women especially, claiming enchantment could be a lifeline. In patriarchal courts where women rarely had power, witchcraft could paradoxically protect them, turning accusation into agency. A woman could say, "I sinned, but I was compelled." In that small act of confession, she took back control of her story. The woman before you now seems to understand that. She stands straighter as the bishop writes her fate in ink. When he finally speaks, his tone is soft. "The marriage is annulled. May your repentance free you." The husband bows, relieved. The woman nods, her expression unreadable. As she turns to leave, the candlelight catches the faintest glimmer of something. Maybe defiance, maybe sorrow, maybe the last trace of her supposed spell. The bishop sighs and gestures for the next case. The clerk scratches his pen across fresh parchment. The audience exhales as if released from a trance. And as you sit there listening to the murmurs fade, you realize that every century has its own version of magic. In theirs it was charms and candles. In ours it might be chemistry, psychology, or sheer chance. But the feeling is the same, that invisible, irrational force that makes us do foolish things in the name of love. The courtroom grows quiet again, the air heavy with incense and burnt wax. Somewhere, outside, a bell tolls midnight, and inside, under the glow of trembling light, another human heart prepares to be judged. The bell fades into the night air, leaving the courtroom cloaked in an uneasy quiet. The candles gutter, smoke curling toward the high beams like faint ghosts. The clerk, bleary-eyed but persistent, reaches for another parchment. His quill scratches the name of the next couple, a man and a woman who stand too far apart to look like newlyweds. You catch a glimpse of their faces, nervous, pale, both trying desperately not to make eye contact. The bishop sighs. "This case," he says, "concerns a question of mistaken identity." "Ah, you already sense this is going to be good. It sounds ridiculous now, doesn't it? The idea of marrying the wrong person by accident. But centuries before photography, before IDs, before reliable records or good lighting, such mistakes happened more often than you'd think. And when they did, the Church called it error of person, a valid and rather humiliating reason to declare a marriage null. The husband, a gaunt man with hair the colour of wheat, bows awkwardly. "Your Grace," he begins, "I believed her to be Anna, daughter of the miller of Wexham, but upon our wedding I discovered she was—" He falters, pointing toward the woman with a trembling hand. Her twin sister, Clara. A few titters break out in the crowd. The bishop's eyebrows rise in weary disbelief. Historians still argue how many of these stories were genuine mistakes and how many were creative excuses. But in this case, it's clear both sides wish they were anywhere else. Clara stares at the floor. "He asked for Anna," she murmurs, but the veil was heavy and I stood beside him. "Our father said it would be fine." It's one of those moments where you can feel the weight of both absurdity and sadness pressing together. A mix-up of names, of veils, of timing. And now, 2 lives about to be legally undone because of it. Cases like this filled the archives of the 14th and 15th centuries. Weddings then were often chaotic affairs, full of drink and confusion, and sometimes, let's be honest, strategic deceit. A family might swap daughters to secure a more favourable match. A groom might realise mid-ceremony that the woman under the veil wasn't quite who he expected, but by then it was too late. There's one famous story from Venice, around 1508, where a man named Lorenzo claimed he'd been tricked into marrying his betrothed's older sister after the younger fell ill. The family, fearing scandal, simply swapped the sisters and hoped he wouldn't notice. He didn't until the morning after, when he remarked that his bride seemed more experienced than anticipated. The court record, by the way, includes that exact phrasing. Some poor scribe had to write it without laughing. Another case from Bavaria tells of a woman who accidentally married her cousin after a nighttime wedding in a dimly lit chapel. When dawn revealed the truth, both parties fainted. The court later annulled the marriage on the grounds of honest error, which might be the kindest euphemism in legal history. But not all mistakes were innocent. In England, a few enterprising impostors took advantage of the confusion. One man, posing as a minor noble, married 3 different women in 3 different towns under 3 different names. When his deception was uncovered, all 3 marriages were annulled and he was sentenced to a lifetime of hard labour, though the court, with almost cheerful understatement, wrote that he possessed an uncommon talent for persuasion. You can't help but admire the creativity in a terrible way. No Tinder, no last names, no photos, just blind trust, candlelight, and the occasional family conspiracy. And yet mistaken identity wasn't just a human failing, it was a theological puzzle. The Church taught that marriage required true consent, freely given, but if you didn't know who you were consenting to, could it really count? Scholars debated it endlessly. Was the soul bound to a name, a face, or the intention? One monk wrote, "If a man weds a woman by another name, is he bound to the name or the person?" You can imagine the headache that caused. Some even wondered if divine intervention might occasionally allow such unions to stand. Perhaps, one bishop mused, God in his wisdom knows which vows were meant. But most courts were less poetic. Mistaken identity meant no marriage, period. The parchment would be stamped, the record filed, and 2 people would walk away, relieved or ruined, depending on how much they'd already shared. In one darkly comic case from 1612, a bride claimed she hadn't realized she'd married the wrong man until weeks later, when her husband revealed a scar on his shoulder that her true fiancé didn't have. When asked how she hadn't noticed sooner, she replied, "We were newlywed and the nights were dark." The courtroom reportedly erupted into laughter, and the bishop declared the marriage invalid, though memorable. Still, these mistakes left ripples. Entire families feuded, dowries vanished, reputations sank. Love turned into legal debris. You picture the current couple again, Clara and her wheat-haired husband, standing before the bishop, waiting for the verdict. And they don't look angry anymore, just drained. The bishop rubs his temples and says softly, "The union was made in error, and so it shall be undone." Clara curtsies and walks away without looking back. The man remains for a moment, as if unsure whether to follow. The court clerk writes down the decision, his quills scratching like the faint ticking of a clock. Outside, the wind moans through the window slits, scattering the faint scent of wax and parchment. The crowd murmurs again, already whispering about the next case. You hear snippets: a nobleman and his maid, a false identity, a love letter found in a confessional. Historians still debate how much of it was true and how much was human theatre. Maybe both. Maybe every annulment was a little play, performed for an audience desperate to see order restored, even when life itself refused to behave. You sit back and exhale, the wooden bench creaking beneath you. Another candle burns low. Another illusion of love has been carefully unstitched, thread by thread. And as the clerk reaches for the next parchment, you realize this courtroom is less a hall of law and more a museum of human folly, one where sincerity, deceit, and sheer bad luck all share the same pew. The next parchment lands on the desk with a soft thud, and the bishop leans back in his chair, rubbing his eyes like a man who's heard every possible story about human foolishness, and then some. But the murmurs in the crowd rise again, because this isn't an ordinary case. It's a royal one. Even in a sleepy medieval courtroom, the words royal annulment have a way of waking everyone up. You can feel the air change, servants inch closer, scribes straighten, and someone discreetly checks their wig. Because when kings and queens petition for annulment, it isn't just about love, it's about power, alliances, and sometimes entire nations balancing on a single marriage bed. The clerk clears his throat, his voice trembling with excitement, as he reads, "The matter concerns His Majesty's union, declared invalid on grounds of spiritual impediment and lack of true consent." Everyone knows what that really means. The king wants out. You can't see his face, of course. Royals never attend these things themselves. But his representatives stand stiffly by, flanked by guards and whispering scribes. Across from them, the Queen's advocates wait in silence. Her chair, noticeably empty, speaks louder than any words could. The bishop nods gravely, though there's a flicker of nervousness in his eyes. This isn't just about theology anymore. This is about survival. One wrong decision, and he could lose his mitre or his head. Historians still debate whether the Church ever truly believed in its own neutrality. When a monarch demanded freedom from a marriage, heaven itself seemed to bend a little. The most famous example, of course, is Henry VIII's infamous crusade to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. You can almost see him in your mind now, broad shoulders, restless eyes, pacing through his chambers as he mutters about God's will and dynastic duty. He'd married Catherine after his brother's death, with a papal dispensation declaring the union valid despite its unusual circumstances. Years later, when no surviving son had been born, Henry began to suspect, or perhaps decide, that God disapproved. His reasoning? Catherine had once been married to his brother, Arthur. If a man shall take his brother's wife, the Bible warned, it is an unclean thing. Conveniently, this came to Henry's mind only after he'd fallen in love with Anne Boleyn. When the Pope refused to annul the marriage, Henry did what any reasonable monarch with a fragile ego and a taste for drama might do. He created his own church. It's easy to laugh now, but at the time, that decision ripped Europe apart. One annulment, one royal mood swing, and suddenly centuries of religious unity dissolved into dust. England got a new church, new doctrine, and, after Anne's beheading, a long series of tragic ironies. But Henry wasn't the only royal to weaponize annulment. In 1492, Louis XIII of France claimed his wife, Jeanne of Valois, was physically incapable of consummation. She was small, frail, and partially deformed from birth. Louis wanted to marry Anne of Brittany instead, for political gain. The trial lasted months, with humiliating testimony and court physicians summoned to inspect Jeanne's body. In the end, the church ruled in Louis's favor. Jeanne accepted the verdict with quiet grace and entered a convent, later declared a saint. Louis, meanwhile, celebrated his freedom by marrying Anne and securing a chunk of French territory. Romantic, not exactly. Effective, very. The lesson was clear. When you're royal, annulment isn't about sin or salvation. It's about strategy. You can almost hear the bishop's pen scratching now as he signs another verdict with trembling hands. The case in front of you isn't Henry's or Louis's, but it follows the same script. A nobleman of high birth declaring his marriage invalid in the sight of God, while conveniently positioning himself for a more profitable match. The advocate for the Queen rises. Her voice is calm but sharp. If God's will changes with the wind, she says, then the church is no more than a flag. A murmur ripples through the hall. You can feel the tension coil like rope. The bishop clears his throat, trying to regain control. The decision, he announces finally, is made with heavy heart but clear conscience. The union is declared null. The royal representatives bow, their relief visible even under the stiff layers of protocol. Somewhere in the back, a scribe exhales quietly, knowing he's just recorded history in the making. Historians still debate whether these rulings were genuine spiritual judgments or carefully staged performances. Some argue the bishops truly believed divine will favored certain unions over others. Others, more cynical, perhaps more honest, suggest that money and politics simply wore cassocks in those days. For ordinary people, these royal annulments were distant theatre, but their effects trickled down, reshaping laws, doctrines, even daily life. When kings changed wives, subjects changed prayers. When queens were set aside, their children vanished from succession charts like ink, wiped clean. You imagine the Queen, miles away from this smoky hall, sitting by a window with hands folded in her lap. Maybe she's praying, maybe she's staring into the distance, realizing that her marriage, her title, her entire life has just been erased by a few strokes of quill and wax seal. The candles flare as a gust of wind slips through the room. The parchment is sealed with a heavy stamp. The bishop leans back, weary, his voice barely above a whisper. May God have mercy on them both. The courtroom hums again, servants murmuring, scribes hurrying, the crowd buzzing with gossip that will soon ripple across kingdoms. You can feel the energy shift from awe to exhaustion. One more life rearranged, one more love story traded for politics. And as you sit there, watching the embers of ambition glow faintly in the candlelight, you can't help but think, perhaps the strangest thing about annulments wasn't the superstition or the scandal, but the quiet truth behind them, that no matter how powerful people became, they still couldn't legislate the human heart. The next case, the clerk announces, concerns bloodlines and the unseen barriers that could end a marriage before it ever began. The air thickens again as the next parchment is unrolled. Even before the clerk begins to read, you can sense that this one feels heavier, not scandalous or strange, but somehow ancient, as though it carries the weight of something older than law itself. The petition, the clerk says slowly, is for annulment on grounds of consanguinity. That single word, consanguinity, slides through the hall like cold water. A few heads bow. A priest murmurs a short prayer. It means blood relation. And in the eyes of the medieval church, shared blood could make a marriage not only improper, but spiritually poisonous. You glance around the courtroom, feeling the shift in the crowd's mood. Gossip fades. Even the bishop sits straighter. These cases weren't funny or scandalous. They were moral puzzles wrapped in theology and superstition, a delicate dance between affection and ancestry. The husband and wife stand together this time, hands clasped. They don't look angry or ashamed. If anything, they look afraid. "Your Grace," the man says quietly, "we did not know we shared a great-grandmother." The bishop sighs. That makes you related in the 4th degree. The couple exchange a look that's part sorrow, part disbelief. You can almost feel the air leave the room. In medieval Europe, marriage wasn't just a union of hearts. It was a transaction of families, lands, and bloodlines. And for centuries, the Church strictly forbade marriage between relatives up to the 7th degree. That didn't just mean cousins, it meant second cousins, great-aunts, in-laws of in-laws, basically anyone who'd ever shared a dinner table, however many generations back. Historians still debate whether these restrictions were about genetics, morality, or politics. Some say the Church wanted to discourage incest and keep noble blood pure. Others argue it was a brilliant administrative move. It gave bishops immense power since only they could grant dispensations. If two people wanted to marry and were related even distantly, they had to buy permission from the Church. It was divine law wrapped in bureaucracy, and a profitable one at that. One chronicler wrote that nearly every noble house in Europe shared kinship with every other, which made finding a completely unrelated spouse practically impossible. The result? Endless requests for dispensations and endless reasons to annul marriages that had already been made. You picture the scene, two families proudly celebrating their alliance, banners flying, wine flowing, and then a priest appears, pale and sweating, clutching a genealogy scroll. "You may not proceed," he declares. "Your fathers were brothers by the 5th degree of kinship." The party stops, mid-toast. Of course, not everyone accepted these rulings gracefully. In 1049, Pope Leo IX annulled the marriage of King Robert van France to his cousin Bertha of Burgundy, even though they had already had children together. The king pleaded for mercy. "I cannot part from her," he wrote. "She is my heart." The Pope refused. Robert was excommunicated. It's hard not to imagine the human cost behind the dry Latin records. The tears, the outrage, the whispered confusion of children suddenly declared illegitimate because someone counted too many great-uncles. The rules changed over time. By the 13th century, Pope Innocent III reduced the forbidden degrees from 7 to 4, partly because people had grown weary of discovering that half their village was technically off-limits. But even then, 4th degree still covered great-grandchildren of common ancestors. The math of medieval morality was complex and often absurd. There's a recorded case from Italy in which a marriage was annulled because a man's deceased wife had once been the godmother of his new bride. Another from Spain involved two peasants who discovered that their fathers had once shared a wet nurse. The court decided this created a spiritual bond equivalent to blood. Their marriage was erased. You can feel the tragedy in it. In small communities, everyone was connected somehow. Love was a trap waiting to spring, a genealogy waiting to ruin you. And yet, the Church believed it was protecting souls. Theologians argued that marrying within your kinship confused the order of creation. Blood, they said, was sacred, a divine map that must not loop back upon itself. To love too close to home was to offend the Creator's architecture. One monk, writing in the 1200s, put it bluntly, "When branches grow too near, the fruit turns bitter." Still, not everyone agreed. Historians note that some bishops quietly ignored the rules, especially for nobles with money or influence. A well-placed donation could transform a sin into a misunderstanding and an annulment into a dispensation. It was a delicate system, one part faith, one part account ledger. The bishop in this courtroom, though, seems torn. His quill hovers above the parchment. The couple stand silently waiting. You can hear every creak of the wood beneath their feet. Finally, the bishop speaks, his voice weary. Though it pains this court, the law is clear. The marriage is null by reason of shed blood. Go in peace, and may God grant you separate paths. The wife lets out a faint sound, half sob, half sigh, and the man reaches for her hand one last time before stepping back. They bow, turn, and walk away in opposite directions. The clerk notes the ruling. The parchment curls slightly as the ink dries. Another life divided by lineage. You sit there, feeling that peculiar ache history leaves behind, the realization that love, which should have united, was torn apart by rules drawn generations before. And as the bishop calls for the next case, you notice something almost poetic in the pattern, how every annulment seems to reveal the same truth whispered between the lines of law and faith, that no matter how sacred, how noble, or how logical the system claimed to be, it was always chasing the same impossible dream, to make love behave according to reason. The hall feels colder now. The cases so far have stretched from the awkward to the absurd, from missing teeth to royal betrayals. But this next parchment, it carries a different kind of unease. The bishop hesitates before breaking its wax seal. You can almost hear the faint tear of red wax giving way to parchment, a small sound that somehow feels ominous. This marriage, the clerk reads, is challenged due to false identity and the misrepresentation of nationality. You blink. False identity. In a world without passports, photographs, or even reliable literacy, that accusation could mean anything. The crowd seems to know it too. There's a ripple of low murmuring, that particular kind of excitement people reserve for the promise of scandal. The husband, a well-dressed man with dark hair and sharp features, stands at attention. His accent is thick, foreign, his expression defiant. The wife sits beside him, pale, trembling, her hands twisting the fabric of her gown. The bishop leans forward. "Your claim, madam?" She hesitates, glancing toward her husband. "He told me he was a merchant from Genoa," she whispers, her voice brittle as spun glass. "He said he had ships, property, family. But I have since learned he is none of those things. He is from elsewhere." A pause. Elsewhere hangs in the air like incense smoke. You can practically see the bishop's expression freeze between disbelief and disapproval. In an era obsessed with lineage and status, a spouse's origin wasn't just background trivia, it was the foundation of their worth. Marriage contracts were economic, spiritual, and political alliances. A lie about one's home could unravel all three. Historians still argue whether these cases were truly about deception or about prejudice, because foreign didn't just mean from another country. It often meant strange, suspicious, unchristian. There's a story from 14th century France of a woman who petitioned to annul her marriage after discovering her husband spoke only Arabic and could not recite the Lord's Prayer. She claimed he must be of infidel birth. The court, uncertain, convened 3 bishops and a translator. The verdict, annulled. Her husband was ordered to return whence he came. No one recorded whether he understood the sentence. You can almost hear the echoes of that same fear here. The wife before you insists she was tricked, deceived, bewitched by exotic charm. The husband tries to interject, but the bishop silences him with a wave. Is it true, he asks, that you were not born in Genoa? The man nods slowly. I was born near Constantinople, he says, but I lived in Genoa for 10 years. I am no liar. I am a traveller. The bishop frowns. You concealed your origin. I concealed nothing, the man replies. She never asked. It's such a modern-sounding defence that you almost smile, until you remember where you are. This is a world where love is a contract and misrepresentation is a sin. The courtroom buzzes again. To marry someone of unknown origin could be interpreted as moral corruption, even heresy. The Church feared the contamination of pagan or Muslim bloodlines, especially during the Crusades. Many couples were annulled simply because one partner could not prove Christian baptism. In one notorious 13th century case, a sailor from Venice married a woman he'd met in Cyprus. When they returned home, the local priest discovered she still spoke prayers in Greek. A schismatic tongue, he declared, and the marriage was dissolved. She returned to Cyprus, where, according to the record, she lived alone, tending to cats. Every era, it seems, has its cat lady. But not all these cases were tragic. Some bordered on farce. In Spain, 1561, a woman married a man she believed to be a Portuguese nobleman. Months later, officials discovered he was actually a runaway stable boy from Toledo who had borrowed his master's clothes. The marriage was swiftly annulled, and the impostor sentenced to public penance. When asked why she hadn't noticed, the wife reportedly replied, "He was so clean and quiet, I thought him refined." There's a sad humour in that. In an age before identity documents, truth depended entirely on confidence and the ability to hold a straight face. Historians still debate whether these foreign bride cases were moral crusades or xenophobic spectacles. Some see them as reflections of genuine fear, the fear of strangers, languages, gods. Others argue they reveal something deeper, that love, when tangled with power, was always one lie away from disaster. The bishop in this courtroom seems unsure which side of that line he's on. He stares at the man, then at the trembling woman. Finally, he says quietly, the Church cannot sanctify what was founded in deceit. The husband protests, "I did not deceive." His voice cracks. "I told her I sought peace, not war. I told her I was baptized." The bishop closes his eyes. "Peace," he says softly, "cannot grow from false soil." The decision is made. The marriage is annulled. The man's shoulders slump. He looks at his wife one last time, not with anger, but with the dull grief of someone who knows words won't help. She meets his gaze for a heartbeat, then looks away. The guards escort him out. The doors creak open, letting in a cold gust of air that rattles the candles. Somewhere in the rafters, a pigeon stirs. The bishop exhales, his expression unreadable. "Let us proceed," he says. But even his voice has lost some of its iron. You sit there, surrounded by the smell of wax and old wood, feeling that familiar mix of pity and disbelief. How easily a single word, foreign, heretic, stranger, could unravel something meant to be eternal. And as the clerk reaches for the next parchment, you realize that in every era, marriage has been less about love and more about belonging, about whether someone's story fits neatly into yours, or whether it threatens to change the ending. The next case, the bishop announces, concerns youth and consent. You hear the words, "too young to wed," echo down the hall, and the crowd leans forward again, eager for another strange collision between innocence and law. The bishop's voice sounds weary now, but the clerk presses on, unrolling another length of parchment with the precision of a man determined to reach the end of an endless night. The crowd shifts, half curious, half tired, when he reads aloud, "The petition concerns an annulment due to immaturity of age and lack of mutual consent." You exhale quietly. "Too young to wed?" It sounds so straightforward, almost merciful, But in this room, under the flicker of trembling candles and the unyielding eyes of holy men, you know that simplicity will not last. The husband is barely a man, 16, maybe 17. His hands tremble as he wrings the brim of his cap. The wife stands beside him, smaller, barely reaching his shoulder. She could be 13, perhaps younger. Her hair is braided tightly, her gaze fixed on the floor. The bishop studies them both for a long time, then turns to the advocates. "Who brings this petition?" A voice answers from the back. It's the girl's father. "I do, Your Grace. My daughter did not give her consent freely. She was too young to know her own mind." The hall murmurs. A few heads nod in sympathy, others frown. In the Middle Ages, marriage was less a romance than a transaction. Girls as young as 12 could be legally wed, and boys at 14, provided they understood the sacrament. But the Church's definition of understanding was, how shall we put this, optimistic. Historians still argue whether those early marriages were meant to protect or control. Some claim they safeguarded alliances and dowries in uncertain times. Others, more cynical, say they simply commodified daughters like parcels of land. In practice, annulments like this one often arose when one party grew up and decided the arrangement was absurd. A 16-year-old might suddenly realize that a vow made at 12 wasn't binding on her adult conscience. And so she, or sometimes her family, would appeal to the Church to declare that she'd been too young to give real consent. You can almost hear the soft tremor of that truth echoing here. The father clears his throat. "My daughter was wed before she understood what marriage meant. She wishes to return home." The bishop nods gravely. "And you, young man, do you contest this?" The boy hesitates. You can see the battle flicker behind his eyes, pride, confusion, maybe heartbreak. I thought she cared for me," he says softly. "But she cries every night. I don't want her to cry." It's quiet for a long time. Even the scribes stop writing. Finally, the bishop sighs. The Church teaches that consent makes the marriage. Without it, there is no union. He raises a hand, signaling the beginning of yet another formal lecture. Back then, the theology of consent was revolutionary. Long before modern civil law caught up, the Catholic Church insisted that marriage wasn't merely a parental contract. It required the free will of both bride and groom. But free will was a slippery concept when parents arranged matches like chess pieces. In many towns, marriages were sealed before puberty and only consummated once both parties came of age. If one partner refused when that time came, the Church could annul the union. But the grey area between childhood promise and adult consent created endless confusion and heartbreaking cases like this. One record from England in 1313 tells of a girl named Agnes, betrothed at 9 and married at 12. When she turned 15, she ran away, declaring, "I was a child when I said yes, and I am not bound by a child's word." The bishop, remarkably, agreed. Her marriage was annulled, though her family disowned her for the scandal. Another story, darker still, comes from Florence. A boy of 14 married a girl of 12. Their parents celebrated. Their estates merged. 2 years later, the boy fell ill and died. The girl, still only 14, was accused of negligence, even witchcraft, because a wife should watch her husband's breath. The court later ruled that she had been too young to bear wifely duty and annulled the marriage posthumously, as though erasing it would erase her grief. You feel a hollow ache behind your ribs. History isn't just absurd, it's cruelly consistent. And yet there were moments of quiet resistance, small rebellions that slipped past the system. In Germany, a nun-turned-lawyer named Hildegard of Bingen once advised a frightened girl to flee her arranged marriage before consummation. "If you do not consent," she wrote, "God does not either." The church never approved that line, but it endured, whispered through convents for centuries like a secret blessing. The bishop in this courtroom seems to carry a trace of that compassion. His voice softens. "You are young," he says to the couple. "Perhaps one day, when time has ripened your hearts, you may meet again, but for now, the sacrament is void." The girl exhales. "It's so faint, you might mistake it for a sigh of wind." The boy looks down, jaw clenched, and nods once. There's no anger in his face, just the bewilderment of youth losing something it barely understood. The clerk writes the ruling in crisp Latin. The candles tremble. Outside, a church bell tolls somewhere far away, as if to remind the world that time keeps moving, even for those too young to follow it. Historians still debate whether these annulments were merciful or hypocritical. But in moments like this, mercy seems the truer answer. Sometimes erasing a marriage was the only way to preserve the innocence it had taken too soon. The bishop leans back. "Next case," he murmurs. The crowd stirs again. The clerk lifts the next parchment, and you catch the faintest glimpse of the first words before he reads them aloud. "Drunkenness and confusion of the ceremony." You almost smile. From innocence to intoxication, history, it seems, never lacks contrast. The words drift through the room like spilled wine. Drunkenness and confusion of the ceremony. A low wave of laughter ripples across the benches. Even the bishop can't help but raise an eyebrow, as if silently praying for strength. After hours of solemn, heavy stories, bloodlines, holy vows, child brides, this one feels like a reprieve. But beneath the humour, there's still something sad, something unmistakably human. The clerk clears his throat, trying not to smile as he reads. The petitioner claims the marriage was performed under intoxication and without true understanding of the vows. You can almost guess what's coming. Somewhere in this smoky courtroom stands a couple who partied too hard before their wedding and woke up legally attached. The husband looks like he'd rather be anywhere else. His doublet is slightly crooked, his eyes red-rimmed. The bride beside him has the pale determination of someone who intends to never touch wine again. A few onlookers snicker, the bishop glares, and the room falls silent. "Speak," he says. The man clears his throat. "Your Grace, it was the feast of St. Martin. There was celebration, much celebration. My friends—" He pauses, realizing that friends isn't going to help. "They told me I'd made a toast to eternal love, and when I woke the next morning, I was married." The bishop's mouth twitches. "And you, madam?" She lifts her chin. "I remember the vows," she says firmly. But he does not. Therefore there was no consent. You can almost hear the audience's collective inhale. It's the medieval equivalent of he said, she said, except this time the church gets to decide whose memory counts. In those centuries, weddings were often noisy, chaotic affairs. Feasts, music, and overflowing ale cups blurred the line between ceremony and celebration. And because the church required only mutual consent, spoken words exchanged before witnesses, a drunken "I do" was enough to bind two souls together for life. Historians still debate how many of these drunken marriages were real accidents and how many were convenient regrets. But there are dozens of records of couples begging for annulment the morning after, sometimes literally. One famous 15th century case from York tells of a blacksmith who took a wife after an evening of heavy drinking. The next day he protested, saying, "I remember neither priest nor prayer, only that she laughed when I fell." The bishop annulled the union, citing inebriation sufficient to destroy consent, which frankly might be the most merciful sentence ever written in Latin. Another case, less fortunate, involved a merchant's daughter in Bruges who wed her suitor after an all-night carnival. The groom later claimed he'd mistaken her for someone else. The court disagreed. Sober or not, he'd said the words. The marriage stood. Their home became known, not kindly, as the House of Regret. You glance at the bishop now, watching him rub his temples, as if this entire courtroom has become one long hangover. He murmurs. When wine loosens the tongue, truth and folly walk hand in hand. It's not the first time he's said it. But drunken weddings weren't limited to peasants or townsfolk. Even nobles fell prey to liquid courage. One French duke in the 1500s married his chambermaid in a spirit of festive mischief during a hunting celebration. When sober, he tried to annul the marriage, claiming he'd acted in jest. The church refused. Holy vows, the ruling said dryly, are not undone by humour. You almost laugh until you remember the chambermaid was later banished to a convent. Her life reduced to a moral footnote in someone else's embarrassment. There's a dark comedy running through all of it, people using intoxication as both a sin and a shield. To the church, drunkenness was moral weakness. To petitioners, it was convenient amnesia. Either way, it was proof that love and liquor were a dangerous mix. The bishop finally speaks again. You claim, he says to the husband, that you were too impaired to consent, and yet you stood, spoke vows and sealed them with a kiss. The man shifts uncomfortably. So I am told. A thin smile crosses the bishop's face. Then it seems you drank enough to forget the marriage, but not enough to forget how to stand. A few muffled laughs break out, quickly silenced by a glare. Historians still argue whether this strictness was about morality or simply about keeping order. The church needed marriage to be stable. If everyone who regretted a wedding could claim drunkenness, chaos would reign. Yet, beneath the rigid theology, there's something relatable about this case. You can feel it in the faces of the couple: embarrassment, frustration, a faint longing to erase one stupid night and pretend none of it happened. The bishop leans forward again, his tone softening. Marriage is not a jest, nor a dream, nor a haze of celebration. It is an oath, and oaths require remembrance. He sighs, glancing at the woman. You remember? She nods. Then the sacrament stands. The man's shoulders slump. The crowd hums with quiet gossip. The verdict is clear. Even drunken vows are still vows. You can almost hear the moral quill scratching its conclusion into parchment. The wife bows her head, grateful, perhaps vindicated. The husband, pale and silent, looks as though he might never attend another feast again. Outside you imagine the chill night, pressing against the church doors, the laughter from taverns drifting faintly through the narrow streets. Inside, the bishop calls for the next case, his patience stretched thinner than parchment. The clerk flips to the next record, and his voice trembles slightly as he reads, "Petition on grounds of coercion and threats made at the altar." You feel a shiver move through the air, from laughter to fear, from foolishness to force. The pendulum swings again. The laughter from the last case still lingers faintly, but it dies quickly as the next parchment is read. The tone in the room changes. The bishop sits straighter, the crowd quiets, and even the candles seem to burn lower, as if they know this one isn't going to end with a chuckle. The clerk's voice is steady but low. The petition concerns coercion and fear at the altar, rendering consent invalid. You shift on the wooden bench. Fear. Not foolishness, not superstition, just raw, ordinary fear. The couple stands before the bishop, and it's immediately clear something is wrong. The woman, young and pale, doesn't look at her husband. Her hands tremble around the edge of her shawl. He stands rigid beside her, a man used to command, his jaw clenched tight, the faint sheen of pride, or maybe guilt, across his face. The bishop studies them both, eyes heavy with suspicion. You claim you were forced? The woman nods. Her voice is barely a whisper. Yes, Your Grace. I did not speak the vows freely. I spoke them because I was told to. That word, told, echoes through the chamber like a dropped coin. She continues. My father said I must. My husband brought men with him to the church. They stood at the doors. The bishop exhales slowly. Were you threatened? Her eyes flicker toward her husband. Not by word, she says, but by the look in their faces. You can feel the discomfort ripple through the room. Even the scribes hesitate before dipping their quills. In the medieval world, consent was the sacred cornerstone of marriage. The church repeated it like a mantra, consensus facit nuptias. Consent makes the marriage. Without it, the sacrament was void. But in practice, that ideal often drowned beneath the noise of power, family honor, and fear. Historians still argue how often forced marriages were truly enforced at sword point, and how often they were subtle coercions, economic pressure, parental threats, reputational ruin. Most cases never reached court because victims rarely had the courage or the social position to speak up. But when they did, the stories that emerged were haunting. One record from 1377 tells of a young woman in Provence who declared she'd been dragged to the altar by her cousins. They held my wrists so that I might not faint, she told the court. The bishop annulled the marriage, but by then her husband had taken her dowry and vanished. The judgment, though righteous, came too late to repair the damage. Another case from England involved a widow forced to remarry her late husband's brother to keep the estate in the family. She refused at first, then agreed after his men surrounded her home. When questioned later, she said simply, I was cold and they brought torches. The bishop wrote that line word for word, as if even he recognized its quiet poetry. You glance back at the woman in this courtroom. She's standing taller now, speaking louder. I begged the priest not to continue, she says. He told me it was God's will. The bishop grimaces. It's a problem he's heard before. Priests, bound to hierarchy, often followed the money or the threats of noble families. They looked the other way. They blessed fear as faith. And yet beneath all that cruelty there were moments of justice. In 15th century Florence, the church introduced a new rule. No marriage was valid unless both parties spoke consent clearly and without fear. A small protection perhaps, but one that gave women leverage they'd never had before. You can almost imagine the courage it took to stand here under the eyes of the church and your husband and say, I was afraid. It's not just confession, it's defiance. The husband finally speaks, his tone hard. She lies. She loved me. Her father agreed. She smiled at the altar. The bishop turns his gaze to him. A smile, he says quietly, may hide a prayer for rescue. The man opens his mouth and then closes it again. The silence between them feels heavier than stone. Historians still debate how often the church actually upheld women's petitions. In some regions, bishops ruled fairly. In others, the same claim might be dismissed as hysteria. It depended on witnesses, on politics, on who held the purse strings. But this court tonight feels different, smaller, humbler, perhaps a little braver. The bishop asks, Do you wish to continue in this union? The woman shakes her head. And you? He asks the husband. He doesn't answer. The bishop sighs and lowers his gaze to the parchment. The church cannot sanctify a vow born of terror. This marriage is null. The crowd exhales. Somewhere, a candle sputters and dies. The husband stands motionless, his face pale. The woman curtsies faintly, her body trembling but upright. For the first time, she looks not afraid, but free. You sit there, feeling the strange mixture of relief and melancholy that history always leaves behind. The law, so often a cage, sometimes opens a door instead. The bishop looks exhausted now, his eyes shadowed. "May God forgive those who make love a weapon," he murmurs, not to the court, but to himself. The clerk writes the final line, his pen scratching like the whisper of rain. "Annulled for fear and coercion at the altar." And then, as if on cue, thunder rolls faintly in the distance. The sound leaks through the narrow windows, mingling with the scent of wax and incense. You close your eyes for a moment, letting the echo fade. When you open them again, the next parchment is already being placed on the table. The clerk's voice wavers slightly as he reads the heading, "Petition for annulment on grounds of spiritual incompatibility, difference of faith." You can almost feel the bishop sigh before he makes it. From fear to faith, the pendulum swings again. The air in the chamber shifts again, less tense than before, but no lighter. The clerk clears his throat, his voice echoing softly through the vaulted hall. "Petition for annulment on grounds of difference of faith." You can practically feel the collective groan ripple through the courtroom. Even the bishop rubs the bridge of his nose. These cases are always complicated. Because faith, unlike bloodlines or youth, is invisible, impossible to prove, yet powerful enough to tear two lives apart. The couple before him looks more weary than defiant. The husband wears the plain clothes of a merchant, his boots dusty from travel. The wife, modestly dressed but proud, holds her hands folded tightly at her waist. They stand close but not together. It's the small distance between them, the quiet kind that says everything. The bishop begins gently. "You claim spiritual incompatibility?" The husband nods. "Yes, Your Grace. My wife no longer shares my faith. She refuses the sacraments, prays in her own words, and will not let our children be baptized." A murmur passes through the crowd like a rustle of leaves, and the wife doesn't flinch. Her chin lifts slightly. "I do not refuse God," she says evenly. "Only your church." It's a simple statement, but in this room it lands like a thunderclap. Historians still debate how genuine such cases were. Some truly were about belief, one spouse converting, the other refusing. Others were political or personal, disguised as theology. In an age when faith defined everything, citizenship, morality, even marriage, difference of religion, was one of the few socially acceptable ways to end what love or patience could not. The bishop leans forward. "You were both baptized in the same church?" The husband nods. "We were." But she was swayed by the heretics from Bohemia. She speaks their words. The bishop's eyes flicker. "The Hussites?" She nods slowly. "I believe in reading Scripture as it is written, not as it is sold." It's a brave thing to say, especially here. The bishop's hand tightens slightly on his chair. "And you no longer attend Mass?" "I attend to my conscience," she says softly. The silence after that sentence is absolute. You can feel the strange mixture of pity and fear ripple through the hall. Everyone knows what happens to heretics, but annulment is merciful compared to exile or fire. The bishop's task tonight is not to condemn, but to contain. Historians still argue whether church courts handled these cases with sincerity or strategy. When Europe began to splinter into reformers and loyalists, annulments became quiet tools of self-preservation. A Catholic husband could claim his wife had fallen into heresy and have the marriage erased, freeing him to remarry within the faith. And the woman, well, her story usually ended there. But sometimes the records show something different. In 1524, a case in Prague involved a couple much like this, Catholic husband, reformist wife. When asked why she had left the church, she said, "Because I saw men buying heaven with coins." Her husband accused her of poisoning their children's souls. The bishop annulled the marriage, but not before writing, "She speaks wrongly, yet with sorrow, more than malice." That one sentence saved her life. The bishop in this courtroom seems to carry that same weariness. "You understand, child," he says softly to the woman, "that by rejecting the sacraments you reject the bond sanctified between you." "I reject nothing holy," she replies, "only that which men have chained to it." You can almost feel the tension in the bishop's shoulders, caught between doctrine and pity. He glances toward the husband. "Do you wish to be reconciled?" The man's jaw tightens. "I have tried, Your Grace. I have prayed, but she will not bend." "Nor should I," she says quietly. "Faith that bends is no faith at all. It's a simple exchange, but it carries centuries of rebellion in it. The kind that begins not with torches or swords, but with one person refusing to kneel where they no longer believe. You can imagine how many marriages must have died this same quiet death across Europe. One spouse turning toward Rome, the other toward Wittenberg or Geneva, or simple silence. Whole households divided by conviction, dinner tables split down invisible lines of theology, and yet amid the tragedy there's something noble about it. These were not people chasing wealth or power, they were chasing truth, however they defined it. And truth, as always, demanded a toll. The bishop's voice drops to almost a whisper. "Then I have no choice. The marriage is dissolved. Let each stand before God as conscience leads." No one moves. The husband bows his head, not triumphantly, but like a man already in mourning. The wife closes her eyes, murmuring something that sounds like a prayer, but not one this bishop would recognize. The verdict is written, sealed, and filed away, but you can feel it linger in the room, the ghost of conviction of two souls who both believed they were right, and perhaps were. Historians still debate whether faith truly divided couples or merely revealed the cracks already there. Maybe belief was just another language for loneliness. The candles burn lower. The bishop exhales, his expression unreadable. "Next petition," he says at last. The clerk unrolls the parchment. You catch the first words before he speaks them. Petition granted on grounds of disappearance and presumed death of spouse. The bishop blinks, the crowd stirs. Ah, yes, the case of the vanishing groom. The murmur that ripples through the hall this time isn't scandal, it's curiosity, tinged with a kind of morbid delight. The phrase disappearance and presumed death does that to people. After all the moral debates and awkward confessions, this one sounds like a story, like something half from legend and half from the village rumour mill. The clerk reads slowly, almost theatrically. The petitioner seeks annulment on account of her husband's unexplained disappearance, an absence exceeding 7 years. 7 years. In the medieval world, that number mattered. It wasn't just arbitrary, it was biblical. The church, cautious even with ghosts, held that if a spouse had vanished without trace for 7 years, the other could petition for the marriage to be declared void. 7 years was long enough, they reasoned, for death or God to have made a decision. The woman before the bishop looks older than her years, wrapped in a dark shawl that whispers of widowhood. Her face is drawn, but her posture carries quiet determination. "Your Grace," she begins, "my husband left for the Holy Land 8 winters ago. There has been no word since. His ship was said to be lost at sea." The bishop nods solemnly. "And you believe him dead?" She hesitates. "I believed it for years. But now another seeks my hand, and I fear to sin if I consent without the Church's leave. It's a strange mix of tragedy and practicality, a woman trapped between love past and love possible, asking permission from men in robes to live again. Historians still argue whether these missing spouse annulments were acts of mercy or simply paperwork to tidy up life's chaos. Some were genuine, travellers lost to war or the sea, vanished merchants swallowed by bandits or disease. But others were far murkier. There's the famous case of Marguerite of Anjou, whose husband disappeared on a trade route to Marseille. Years later, she remarried, only for the first husband to reappear, thin, sunburned, and very much alive. His first words, reportedly, were, "Is supper ready?" Her second marriage was immediately annulled. The Chronicle notes, with delicate understatement, that the lady fainted upon hearing the decree. You glance at the woman before you now, her hands clasped tightly together. Maybe she's seen that kind of ghost in her mind 1,000 times, her husband's shadow walking back through the door, too late and too changed to claim her. The bishop leans forward. "Did you make inquiry into his fate?" She nods. "We sent word to Venice, to Cyprus, to the ports beyond. None had seen him. Even his companions did not return." One of the priests murmurs something about maritus maris perditus, the husband lost to the sea. A phrase that sounds almost poetic until you realize how many lives it described. In those centuries, the sea was both highway and graveyard. Thousands vanished between one port and another, their names washed away with the tide. The Church's 7-year rule was meant to offer closure, a kind of theological mercy. But there were always complications, letters that arrived years too late, sailors who stumbled home after everyone had moved on, ghosts who turned out to be flesh and bone. Historians still debate which story was the most absurd. Some mention the widow from Cornwall who remarried after 7 years, only for her first husband to return just in time for her second wedding. The bishop, caught between horror and amusement, declared, "God has poor timing." Others tell of a Spanish noblewoman who lived happily for decades with her second husband until her first returned from captivity in Algiers. The church ordered her to reunite with him, but both husbands refused. The bishop eventually gave up and declared her married to God. You can't help but admire the resilience of those women, torn between duty and common sense, yet forced to live by the logic of parchment and candles. The woman in this courtroom seems to understand that better than most. She speaks again, her voice trembling slightly. "I do not seek to forget him, Your Grace, only to live without sin." The bishop nods. There's a flicker of compassion in his eyes. "You have waited faithfully. You have sought the truth and found none. The Church grants release." A collective breath seems to escape the hall. The clerk writes the decree, sealing it with red wax that glistens under the dim candlelight. And then the door creaks open. A tall man stands there, his clothes travel-worn, his hair streaked with salt. The murmurs begin instantly. The bishop rises halfway from his chair. The woman turns, her hands flying to her mouth. "Your Grace," the man says hoarsely, "I am her husband." For a heartbeat, no one moves. Then the woman steps forward, shaking her head as though disbelief might rewrite reality. "You were dead," she whispers. "I nearly was," he says. "Our ship wrecked off Cyprus. I live by the mercy of strangers." The bishop closes his eyes. Of course, 7 years, the perfect number for fate's cruel joke. The man looks at the parchment on the desk, the fresh seal gleaming beside his name. "I came as soon as I could," he says softly. "I feared she would think me faithless." Historians still argue about cases like this, whether the reappearance of a spouse nullified a second marriage automatically, or whether compassion could override law. But in this courtroom, there's no debate. There's only the aching sound of 2 lives colliding after too much time apart. The bishop exhales heavily. The decree is suspended. he says. The marriage remains as God first made it. The man bows his head. The woman stands motionless, caught between relief and ruin. The crowd stares, caught between sympathy and thrill. You can almost feel the chill of that realization settling over everyone. That love, even when declared dead, has a habit of haunting the living. The bishop murmurs a prayer, his voice barely above a whisper. The candles tremble, as though the flame itself recoils from the twist of fate. When the couple finally leaves the hall, they walk side by side, but not touching. Not yet. Maybe never again. Outside, a gust of wind rattles the doors. Inside, the clerk wipes his brow and whispers, "Next petition." The bishop groans softly. "Please tell me it's simple." The clerk scans the parchment. It concerns secret marriages performed without witnesses. The bishop mutters, "God preserve me." You almost smile. After ghosts and miracles, the next act promises mischief of a different kind. The bishop rubs his temples as the next parchment is presented, the faint scent of wax and fatigue thick in the air. You can feel it too, the sense that every possible variety of heartbreak has already passed through this hall. And yet, here comes another. The clerk clears his throat, his voice carrying through the flickering candlelight. Petition concerning clandestine or secret marriages performed without witnesses. The bishop groans softly as though these words summon an old and familiar headache. You shift in your seat. Secret marriages, of course. The forbidden thrill of vows whispered in the dark, promises exchanged under stars instead of steeples. You can already sense that this case won't be about saints or sinners, but about foolish, lovesick humans trying to outwit the rules of the world. The couple before the court doesn't look dangerous. They're young, almost boyish, their hands fidgeting, their expression somewhere between defiance and terror. They're the sort of people who would have made a lovely story, if the church hadn't turned love into something you needed a permit for. The bishop stares at them over his spectacles. You admit you exchanged vows in secret? The young man nods. Yes, Your Grace. In the orchard behind her father's house. The girl clutches his arm. We spoke the words. We promised before God. And you had witnesses? She hesitates. Only the moon. The bishop closes his eyes briefly, the way a parent does when trying to summon patience. Then you had none. In the medieval world, marriage was both sacrament and social contract. The church, desperate to keep order amid chaos, required public vows and witnesses to make a marriage valid. Without those, no matter how sincere, the union could be declared void. The reasoning was simple enough. Love might be impulsive, but land and lineage were not. Historians still argue whether these rules were moral safeguards or bureaucratic overreach. Some say they protected women from deceitful lovers who whispered promises only to vanish. Others claim they simply protected the church's control over who got to love whom and when. But the human heart has never been good at following policy. There's a record from 1395 of a young scribe named Hugo who secretly married a baker's daughter beneath a willow tree. They sealed their vows with a ribbon tied around their wrists, a custom older than Christianity itself. When the girl's father discovered it, he dragged her to court. Hugo was fined, excommunicated, and ordered to marry her properly in public, which he did to the sound of scandalized applause. The chronicler noted with reluctant fondness that they remained married for 40 years. Not everyone was so lucky. A tragic case from Florence in 1472 tells of lovers who exchanged vows privately, then parted for years, she to a convent school, he to trade in Venice. When he returned, she was engaged to another. He produced a letter she'd written, "My heart is yours before God," and claimed it was proof of marriage. The bishop ruled that while her soul might be bound, her body was not. She married the other man. The first lover joined the clergy. You look back at the couple before you now. Their fingers still brush, tentative and trembling. They aren't thinking about law or inheritance. They're thinking about each other, and perhaps about the night they thought their secret promise would be enough. The bishop's tone softens, but only slightly. Children, he says, a vow must be witnessed to stand in heaven and on earth. Without witnesses, there is no sacrament. Without sacrament, there is no marriage. The girl's eyes well with tears. We meant it, she whispers. I do not doubt it, says the bishop gently. But meaning and law are not the same thing. It's the same old paradox. The church claimed to sanctify love, but in doing so it chained it. Historians still debate how clandestine marriages became such an epidemic in the Middle Ages. Some say it was rebellion, the youth of Europe quietly refusing to let priests dictate their hearts. Others point to practical reasons: dowries, inheritance, politics. A secret vow could protect love from greedy parents, at least for a time. The problem was that secret love only stayed secret until it caused trouble. And trouble always came. Pregnancies, rival claims, bigamy accusations. Suddenly the church would be dragged into the mess, forced to decide whether the moon and a whispered promise really counted as holy witness. You can almost imagine the bishop's dilemma: how to balance faith and law, sincerity and proof. He looks at the couple again, his voice slow and measured. Do your families know of this union? The young man shakes his head. They would have forbidden it. And yet, says the bishop, you made it anyway. The boy nods, eyes defiant. Because love is not theirs to forbid. You can almost hear a few muffled gasps from the crowd. The bishop leans back, studying him. You speak boldly, he says. But remember, love without law is wind without a sail. Still there's a faint tremor of admiration in his tone. He was young once too. After a long pause, he delivers his judgment. The church does not recognize the union. It is annulled in the eyes of men, but in the eyes of God, only he can say. The couple stands frozen. The girl whispers, Does that mean we are free? The bishop looks away. It means, he says softly, that you were never truly bound. You can see the tears gather in her eyes, not because of punishment, but because of erasure. To be told that something so real, so deeply felt, never existed, that is a cruelty only bureaucracy could invent. The boy takes her hand as they leave, ignoring the whispers that follow them down the aisle. Historians still argue whether these rulings protected the innocent or destroyed the sincere. But you suspect the answer, as always, depends on who's telling the story. The clerk notes the verdict and pulls the next parchment from the stack. His voice trembles slightly as he reads, Petition for annulment due to clerical error and absence of proper registration. The bishop exhales, a long, weary sigh. Ah, yes, he mutters, the sins of ink and paper. You lean back, smiling faintly. After all these years, it's oddly comforting to know that even in the grand theatre of history, the next disaster could still begin with bad handwriting. The bishop looks as though he's aged a decade in a single night. He rubs his forehead, and you can almost hear the faint creak of bone beneath the skin. The clerk, unbothered, straightens the next parchment and reads, in that same crisp, bureaucratic voice, Petition for annulment due to clerical error and improper registration of the marriage. You nearly laugh, not out loud, of course, but inwardly. After witchcraft, vanishing husbands, and drunken grooms, here comes the most mundane villain of all. Paperwork. The bishop exhales, muttering something about the devil hiding not in sin, but in ink. The couple before the court looks normal. Almost too normal. No tears, no trembling, no scandal clinging to their clothes like smoke. Just a husband and wife who seem quietly resigned to the absurdity of being here. The bishop gestures tiredly. "Explain, please." The husband bows. "Your Grace, we were wed 2 years past. The priest who performed the ceremony has since died. His records, we are told, were never entered into the parish registry. The magistrate says we are not married in law. Our children, by extension," he hesitates, "are not legitimate." The bishop groans softly. God preserve us from misplaced ledgers. You can almost see the irony shimmering in the candlelight. Two people stand here who are married in every sense that matters, except on paper. In the Middle Ages and Renaissance, the Church insisted on written proof of marriage, not out of distrust, but out of necessity. Property, inheritance, legitimacy, these things demanded documentation. Without it, entire lineages could unravel. And yet ink faded, priests died, records burned in fires or were eaten by rats. And suddenly lives were undone by smudged parchment. Historians still debate how many marriages simply vanished into administrative limbo. Some estimate thousands. Entire families erased from legitimacy because a single clerk forgot to copy a name. One record from Cologne describes a newly widowed woman who discovered her marriage was unregistered. Her husband's relatives seized his property, claiming she was merely a mistress. She petitioned the church, presenting their wedding ring, her children's baptism records, and the sworn testimony of 5 witnesses. The bishop sympathized, but ruled that, without the official entry, the sacrament remains doubtful. She died penniless. Another case from Milan was stranger still. A priest, short on parchment during a famine, reused an old scroll, scraping off old names, writing new ones. Years later, 2 couples appeared in court, both claiming the same wedding date and certificate. The bishop reportedly stared at the document for a full minute before saying, "Either God has a twin or someone has lied." Both marriages were suspended pending divine clarification. But for all the absurdity, these errors carried real pain. To the church, an unrecorded marriage wasn't a sin, it was an absence. And absence, in legal terms, might as well have been death. The wife speaks now, her voice calm but trembling at the edges. "We were joined before God," she says. "We shared bread, home and bed, but they say our vows do not exist because a man forgot to write them." The bishop's face softens. "And you wish the union declared valid?" "Yes," she says, gripping her husband's hand. "We want what already is." There's something quietly heroic about her phrasing, simple, dignified, weary of bureaucracy. The bishop nods. "The church does not unmake what heaven has bound through honest vows." He gestures to the clerk. "Have we evidence of the ceremony?" The clerk fumbles through a stack of fading papers, producing a folded letter. "A witness's statement, Your Grace. The bride's cousin confirms the vows were spoken before Father Bartolomeo." "Then why the petition for annulment?" the bishop asks. The husband sighs. "Because the magistrate will not accept it. They say we must start anew, either with a new wedding or a declaration of nullity. One erases our past, the other makes us strangers again. We thought, perhaps Your Grace could decide which hurts less." That sentence hangs in the air, which hurts less. It's the kind of line that belongs not in a courtroom, but in a prayer. Historians still argue whether church courts handled such moments with mercy or indifference. Some bishops were sticklers for order, no record, no marriage. Others, like this weary man before you, tried to patch the holes bureaucracy left behind. He studies the couple for a long time. Finally, he says quietly, "The sacrament is not ink, but intention." If you consented freely before a priest, you are wed in the eyes of God, even if men have misplaced the evidence. The husband exhales shakily. The wife's eyes glisten. But, the bishop continues, you must repeat your vows publicly before witnesses so that no future fool with a pen can claim otherwise. It's a compromise, half legal, half merciful. He gestures for the couple to step forward. 2 witnesses are summoned from the benches, a sleepy clerk and a curious bystander. The bishop nods. Repeat your vows. The husband takes his wife's hand. His voice is hoarse, but steady. I, Matteo, take you, Elisabetta, as my lawful wife. Her reply trembles, but doesn't break. I, Elisabetta, take you, Matteo, as my lawful husband. It's brief, honest, almost too human for parchment to hold. The bishop smiles faintly. There, now it exists twice, once on earth and once in heaven's copybook. The crowd chuckles softly, a rare sound in this hall of sighs. Historians still quote that phrase, in fact. Some found it quaint, others saw in it the weary wit of a man who'd spent his life trying to make eternity fit inside bureaucracy. The bishop waves the couple away with a blessing, and the clerk seals their new record with wax, pressing it until it gleams red in the candlelight. Outside, the storm has passed. A faint wind slips through the cracks, carrying the smell of wet stone and parchment ink. The bishop leans back, closing his eyes. Next, he says quietly. The clerk hesitates, glancing at the next parchment. It concerns prohibited unions by profession, Your Grace. The petitioner married a man sworn to holy service. The bishop's eyes open slowly. His lips curve into a humorless smile. Ah, he murmurs, the priest who forgot his vows, or remembered them too late. You feel a chill crawl through the air. The next story, you sense, will not end as gently as this one. The air feels colder again, even though the candles still burn. The bishop sits a little straighter, bracing himself. When the clerk unrolls the parchment, the words come out like a confession already rehearsed. Petition for annulment due to marriage made in violation of holy orders and vows. A quiet gasp ripples through the chamber. Everyone knows what that means. A priest or a monk has broken his oath. You can almost hear the creak of the pews as people lean forward, their curiosity outweighing their reverence. These cases were rare, scandalous and dangerous because they didn't just test love or law, they tested God. The accused stands at the center of the room, head bowed. His robe is plain black, the hem frayed, the tonsure still faintly visible on his crown. Beside him, the woman, young, visibly frightened, clutches a rosary so tightly that her knuckles shine white. The bishop studies the man with something between pity and anger. You are ordained, the man's voice is low, steady. I was, Your Grace. I left the monastery 4 years ago. And you wed this woman knowing that your vows were perpetual? Yes. The bishop sighs heavily. And yet you ask us to undo the sin after committing it. In that sentence lies the cruel logic of these courts. The church that could forgive murder still hesitated to forgive love. Historians still debate how rigidly these vows were enforced. Technically, priests and monks were forbidden from marrying since the 12th century, when celibacy became mandatory in the Western Church. But enforcement was flexible. Rural parishes often looked the other way, especially if a beloved priest simply happened to live with his housekeeper. Still, when the church wanted to make an example, it could be merciless. The man raises his head now. His eyes are calm but tired, like someone who's been waiting for judgment longer than he's been living in peace. I loved her, he says simply. I believed that love could not damn what God had blessed. The bishop leans forward. Did you speak those words before the altar? He nods. "We did, quietly, no witnesses. I said her name as I once said the name of the Virgin." The murmurs that follow are sharp enough to cut the air. You glance at the woman. She doesn't cry, she just looks bewildered, as though she's wandered into a world where love is a language no one here understands. Historians still argue whether these couples were rebels or victims, whether they defied the system or were crushed beneath it. To the church, their union was null because one partner had already pledged himself entirely to God. But to the people who lived it, those vows were just different words for the same longing, to belong to something greater than loneliness. There's an old record from Toledo, 1518, a priest named Father Rodrigo, who confessed to marrying his parishioner in secret after years of tending to her sick family. When confronted, he said, "If God did not wish me to love her, why did he place her within reach of my prayers?" The bishop stripped him of office and ordered him to spend the rest of his life in penance. His wife was sent to a convent for her protection. The chronicle closes with the phrase, "Both were lost to the world." You can feel the same tragedy simmering here. The bishop's tone sharpens. You took vows before heaven. You broke them for a woman. The priest, because that's what he still is, even now, meets his gaze. "And yet heaven did not strike me down." It's a dangerous answer, the kind that could echo in a man's memory long after the candles are gone. The bishop looks to the woman. "And you? Did you know he was bound by holy orders?" She hesitates. "He told me he had left that life. I thought his vows were broken when his heart was." For a moment, the room goes still. Even the quills have stopped scratching. The bishop presses his palms together. "You are not the first to mistake comfort for sanctity, but the rules of heaven do not yield to affection." He says it like he's said it 1,000 times before. And maybe he has. The petition is almost a formality now. Everyone knows how this will end. But the bishop still pauses, perhaps hoping that silence might soften what must come next. Finally, he says, "This union is null. The man remains in sin until he repents and returns to his vows. The woman is absolved of guilt." The woman closes her eyes. Her lips move, whispering a prayer that no one hears. The man just nods, almost gratefully. "Do you repent?" the bishop asks. The priest shakes his head. "I will not deny her. If repentance means forgetting, then I choose damnation." That line lands like a spark in a powder room. The bishop slams his hand on the arm of his chair. "Then you are lost." The man bows slightly. "Perhaps, but I am not alone." For the first time, the woman looks up, her eyes shining, not with fear, but something steadier. The bishop waves for the guards, his patience spent. "Remove him. Deliver him to the abbot of St. Denis for correction." 2 guards approach. The priest goes quietly, but not before turning to her one last time. "Do not let them tell you it was a sin to love." She doesn't answer. She just nods, her hand brushing the rosary, her expression unreadable. As the doors close behind him, the bishop exhales shakily, muttering a Latin prayer under his breath, something about obedience and grace. But his voice wavers on the word obedience. Historians still debate how such stories should be remembered. Were they tales of weakness, or quiet revolutions whispered in the language of love? Perhaps both. The woman leaves the courtroom silently, her shawl trailing across the flagstones. When the door shuts behind her, the hall feels emptier than it has all night. The bishop finally looks up. "Next," he says, his voice barely above a whisper. The clerk hesitates before reading the next parchment. "Petition on grounds of bigamy and hidden marriage." A few heads snap up. The bishop grimaces. "Ah," he murmurs, "the ghosts of the living." You feel your pulse quicken slightly, because this next case, unlike all the others, will not be about the dead or the divine. It will be about deceit. The bishop exhales through his nose like a man bracing for a storm. The courtroom, weary from hours of scandal, straightens again. You can feel the collective curiosity return, because bigamy always draws a crowd. Adultery could be forgiven, but 2 simultaneous marriages? That was an art form of deceit few could resist watching unravel. The clerk clears his throat and begins, "Petition for annulment due to concealment of prior marriage." The respondent is accused of contracting a second union, while the first remained valid and undissolved. A few murmurs ripple through the benches. Someone whispers, "A double husband?" Another hisses, "A double wife?" You glance toward the accused, a man of middle age, clean-shaven, dressed better than most. He stands with a merchant's posture, confident but not defiant. His second wife sits beside him, pale as wax, her hands clutching a handkerchief she's already torn to shreds. The bishop peers down at him. "You are called Jonas of Rouen?" "Yes, your grace." "And you are accused of marrying this woman?" He gestures to the trembling wife, while still bound to another. Jonas hesitates. "Bound, perhaps, but not attached." A few nervous laughs rise, quickly silenced. The bishop's eyes narrow. "Do not jest in the house of God." Jonas lowers his gaze. "I meant only that I believe my first wife dead. She took ill in Flanders years ago. I left her with her kin. I received word she did not survive." "Word from whom?" He pauses. "A friend." "Name him." Jonas clears his throat. "He cannot be found." The bishop sighs, rubbing his temples. So convenient, these missing friends. Historians still argue how common these cases really were. Some estimate that 1 in every few hundred marriages had doubtful legitimacy due to overlapping unions, accidental or deliberate. Men travelled, wars displaced families, ships sank. Sometimes it was a misunderstanding, sometimes it was ambition, and sometimes, let's be honest, it was greed. There's a record from 15th century York of a tanner who married a woman in his village, then another in a neighbouring parish under a false name. When caught, he argued that the first ceremony did not take, since the priest had sneezed during the vows. The bishop, unimpressed, had him branded on the cheek with the letter B. Another case from Paris tells of a woman who married 3 men over 20 years, each in a different district. When finally confronted, she insisted she had been searching for the truest one. The court declared her marriages null, but spared her punishment, perhaps out of sympathy, perhaps admiration for her logistical skill. You look back to Jonas, who's sweating now, his charm dissolving under the weight of scrutiny. The bishop leans forward. "Do you deny that your first wife still lives?" Jonas's jaw works silently for a moment. Then, "No, your grace, I do not deny it. She returned last winter." The crowd stirs, the sound of shock spreading like a shiver. The bishop's tone sharpens. "Returned?" "She came to my door, frail, begging for forgiveness." "And what did you do?" "I gave her bread," Jonas mutters, "and told her to leave before my new wife woke." A low hiss of disapproval moves through the benches. The bishop's knuckles whiten on the arm of his chair. The second wife finally speaks, her voice cracking. "You told me she was a ghost." Jonas doesn't look at her. "I believed it once." It's hard to know whether he's lying now or then, but the tragedy is clear either way. The bishop shakes his head. "Marriage is not a coat to be changed with the weather. You have bound 2 souls and dishonoured both." The law in such cases was merciless. Bigamy wasn't just a sin, it was a felony. The first marriage always stood, the second was declared null. and the guilty party faced public penance or exile. In some regions, bigamists were made to parade through the town square, wearing 2 nooses, one for each spouse they'd betrayed. Jonas bows his head. "I have sinned, Your Grace, but I meant no harm." "You never do," the bishop says softly. "None of you ever do." Historians still debate the Church's deeper motive in these rulings. Was it truly moral outrage or fear of disorder? 2 marriages meant 2 inheritances, 2 households, 2 conflicting legal realities, and chaos terrified the Church more than sin. But in these candlelit halls, chaos was always disguised as confession. The bishop turns to the second wife, his voice gentler. "You are innocent in this matter. You are released from all bonds to him." She nods slowly, tears spilling freely now. "And his first wife?" "She remains the only one in law. Whether she chooses to forgive him is her concern, not ours." The bishop raises his hand, signalling the end of the hearing. "Let it be recorded. This union is null. The man shall confess his deceit publicly before the parish and give alms to both women." Jonas bows stiffly. The guards step forward, but he doesn't resist. As he turns to leave, the second wife speaks one last time, her voice so low you barely hear it. "If he lied for love, perhaps that is punishment enough." The bishop doesn't respond, but for a moment his eyes soften. Because even now, centuries later, historians still can't decide whether to pity these people or to laugh at them. Perhaps both. You glance around the courtroom, faces half-lit, half-shadowed, and you realize something quietly profound. Every one of these cases, however absurd, begins in the same place. Not law, not sin, just loneliness. The clerk dips his pen and writes the ruling in neat Latin strokes. When he finishes, the bishop gestures for the next case. The clerk clears his throat. "Petition for annulment due to unnatural infirmity and failed remedies thereof." The bishop groans. "Infirmity," he mutters. "Ah, yes, the polite word for scandal." You already know what's coming, and you can't help but smile grimly. The courts are about to revisit their most uncomfortable subject, anatomy, alchemy, and the peculiar intersection between faith and flesh. The word infirmity lands in the courtroom like a drop of ink on parchment, small but spreading fast. You can feel the unease ripple through the benches, the whispered chuckles, the suppressed coughs. The bishop's face tightens, his patience thinning visibly. "Read it," he says curtly. The clerk clears his throat. "Petition for annulment on grounds of unnatural infirmity, specifically the inability to consummate the union and the failure of all attempted remedies thereof." A long pause. Someone in the back snorts quietly before being silenced by a glare. The bishop exhales through his nose, steepling his fingers. "Bring them forward." The couple walks to the centre. The husband, tall and gaunt, looks like he hasn't slept in months. The wife stands beside him, beautiful but stiff, her expression caught somewhere between embarrassment and defiance. Neither looks at the other. "You are Thomas of Canterbury?" the bishop asks. "Yes, Your Grace." "And this is your wife, Margaret?" "Yes." The bishop nods, weary. "You petition for annulment because your union remains unfulfilled?" Thomas swallows. "Yes, Your Grace." Margaret's voice cuts in sharply. "Unfulfilled and unfixable." The bishop coughs awkwardly. "You've consulted healers?" "Several," she says crisply. "One suggested leeches, another a poultice of goat's milk and rosemary. None proved fruitful." A ripple of laughter threatens to escape the room. The bishop raises a hand for silence. You can almost feel the absurdity balancing on the edge of tragedy. This isn't about cruelty or deception. It's about bodies, expectations, and the quiet humiliation of falling short of what God or society expects. In medieval Europe, impotence was not just a private sorrow, it was a legal disaster. A marriage could be declared null if the husband, or occasionally the wife, was deemed incapable of the act. The Church took this very seriously, so seriously that it often summoned physicians, witnesses, and, in the worst cases, physical examinations. Historians still debate whether these trials were acts of cruelty or desperate attempts at fairness. The logic was clear. A marriage without consummation could not fulfill its divine purpose of unity and procreation. But in practice, it was public humiliation dressed as justice. The bishop clears his throat. "And when did you first realize the infirmity?" Margaret folds her arms.
"On the wedding night, Your Grace, and every night thereafter." Thomas's jaw tightens. "It is not as simple as that. There were conditions, nerves. The room was cold." The bishop looks like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Have you sought spiritual counsel?" Thomas nods. "I prayed. I fasted. I even walked barefoot to St. Cuthbert's shrine." "And?" He hesitates. "My feet healed faster than the rest." Someone in the gallery stifles a laugh. The bishop shoots them a glare, then sighs. "Margaret, you claim this has persisted beyond healing?" "Yes, Your Grace. 2 years. He has been blessed by 3 priests, dosed by 4 apothecaries, and frightened by 1 exorcist." "An exorcist?" "Yes," she says flatly. "They thought perhaps a demon was involved. It wasn't." You can almost hear the bishop's patience being ground into dust. Historians still argue over how the church handled these delicate cases. Some bishops demanded brutal proof, ordering the couple to live apart and submit to tests of potency. Others chose discretion, citing compassion and divine mystery. A few even allowed annulments on faith alone, preferring to spare everyone the indignity of evidence. This bishop, mercifully, seems to favour the latter. He leans forward, his voice quiet. "Thomas, do you admit your inability?" Thomas hesitates, torn between pride and shame. Finally, he nods. "I do, though I swear it was not by choice. And Margaret, you do not wish to remain bound." Her answer is immediate. "No, Your Grace. I want a life, not a vigil." The bishop exhales slowly, almost tenderly. "The church does not bind where nature refuses. The union is null." Thomas looks relieved and destroyed all at once. Margaret closes her eyes, whispering something that might be gratitude or apology. But before the verdict is sealed, the bishop adds quietly, "However, I caution you both, God's mercy is not a cure for shame. What you could not build in flesh, you must bury in peace." That line will linger in the records. It's gentle, almost poetic, a rare flash of grace in a world that loved its rules more than its people. Historians still debate whether annulments like this were truly merciful or merely efficient. The church needed order, couples needed closure. Between the two, hearts were often left unattended. As the couple leaves, the air in the courtroom softens. Even the clerk looks a little humbled as he writes the ruling. Marriage dissolved by natural impediment, proven incurable. You imagine Thomas walking out into the rain, head bowed, perhaps feeling lighter for the first time in years, and Margaret, somewhere behind him, finally breathing without the weight of disappointment pressing down on her chest. The bishop sits back, eyes closed. "Next case," he murmurs. The clerk hesitates before reading. "Petition for annulment based on the claim of supernatural interference and unclean enchantment." The bishop's eyelids flick open. He groans. "Ah, witchcraft, of course." You can almost see his soul leave his body, because every courtroom eventually finds its way to that familiar frontier, where love, religion, and fear of magic collide in glorious, nonsensical spectacle. The word enchantment sends a shiver through the courtroom, not of awe, but of superstition.
Even the candles seem to tremble, as if aware that the boundary between sin and sorcery has just been crossed. The bishop sits forward, expression flat but eyes wary. "Proceed," he says. The clerk clears his throat, reading the charge slowly. "Petition for annulment on the grounds that the marriage was rendered void by witchcraft, curses, or other supernatural impediments preventing natural affection or consummation." There's an audible gasp. The murmuring starts again, hushed, feverish, like wind through dry reeds. You can almost smell the fear in the air, that ancient scent of incense and panic. The bishop gestures, bring the parties forward. The husband and wife step into view. He is a stern-looking farmer, hands rough, knuckles cracked, his face pinched with both shame and anger. The woman beside him wears a plain shawl pulled tight over her hair. Her eyes are dark, defiant, but tired, as though she's already lived this scene 100 times. The bishop begins gently, almost cautiously. "You accuse your wife of witchcraft?" "Yes, Your Grace," the man says firmly. "Since our wedding, no peace has entered my house. The cows give sour milk, the fields rot overnight, and when I share her bed, my body grows cold as stone." The woman's lips tighten. "Perhaps, Thomas, it's because you drink more ale than water." Laughter breaks out before the bishop's glare silences it. He turns to her. "And you deny these charges?" She nods. "I deny nothing but his madness. I am no witch. I'm only unfortunate to have married one who blames the moon for his own laziness." You almost smile. If courage were a crime, she'd already be guilty. The bishop exhales. "And yet," he says, "you must understand, child, that these matters cannot be dismissed lightly. Witchcraft corrupts not only the body but the soul. If enchantment be proven, this marriage is null by the laws of both heaven and man." She stares at him. "How does one prove the invisible?" He doesn't answer. Historians still argue whether cases like this were truly about magic or simply about fear. Fear of women, fear of misfortune, fear of anything that couldn't be explained by scripture or science. In the Middle Ages, superstition filled the gaps logic couldn't reach. When crops failed or passion cooled, it was easier to blame a spell than to face the mess of being human. The bishop gestures to the clerk. "Have any witnesses come forward?" The clerk nods. "Two, Your Grace, the husband's sister and a local healer." The first witness steps forward, a thin woman with sharp eyes and the satisfaction of someone who has waited a long time to be right. "Your Grace," she says, "I have seen her mutter charms into her stew and tie knots into her husband's shirts." The bishop raises a brow. "Knots?" "Yes. Love knots, or hate knots, I can't say which, but she ties them when she thinks no one's looking." The accused sighs. They were knots. "For laundry, because I am not a witch. I am a wife with shirts to wash." You can almost hear the suppressed chuckles. The bishop pinches the bridge of his nose. The second witness, the healer, is older and more cautious. "I've treated them both," she says. "He came to me claiming his strength was stolen by a spell. She came to me asking for patience to bear his temper."
"I found no witchcraft, only exhaustion." The bishop seems to like this answer, but the husband scowls. "She lies to protect her kind," he mutters. The woman turns sharply. "My kind? You women who think herbs and whispers can change a man's fate." "Someone must," she snaps. "God knows you men never do." That earns her a warning glare, but not punishment. You can sense the bishop's sympathy creeping through his fatigue. Historians still debate how often these accusations were weaponized, used by men to escape unhappy marriages or by communities to punish women who didn't know when to stay silent. The evidence was almost always the same: spoiled food, bad dreams, sudden disinterest. The so-called proofs were absurd, but the consequences were very real. In one record from 1452, a husband claimed his wife bewitched him into impotence and demanded an annulment. The court ordered her to perform a test. She had to touch him in public, and if he still failed to respond, the spell was proven false. It's said the bishop who presided immediately declared her innocent after the man fainted from embarrassment. The bishop here, perhaps remembering that precedent, folds his hands. The church does not deal in superstition, he says firmly. We are not a market of charms. Unless there is evidence of oath-breaking or unholy rites, this court cannot rule on magic. The husband stiffens. Then my torment continues? The bishop sighs. Perhaps your torment lies in your imagination, not your marriage. The man flushes red, jaw tightening. The woman looks at the bishop, her expression softening for the first time. Thank you, Your Grace, she says quietly. But he isn't done. However, he continues, it is clear this union has turned to bitterness. The vows may not have been corrupted by witchcraft, but they have been corroded by mistrust. For that reason, the church grants separation without annulment. A small murmur ripples through the room. Not quite victory, not quite punishment, just a hollow kind of freedom. The husband glares, muttering something under his breath. The wife exhales slowly, as though she's been holding that breath for years. As they leave, the bishop leans back, muttering to himself, God forgive this century, even love must now stand trial for sorcery. Historians still debate whether he meant it as sarcasm or despair. Perhaps both. The clerk wipes his quill, then reaches for the next parchment. Petition, he announces, for annulment based on deception of lineage, specifically claims of false nobility. The bishop groans softly. From witches to liars, he mutters. Truly, love has many disguises. You can feel the tension lift just slightly, curiosity taking its place again, because the next case, this one, isn't about demons or saints. It's about vanity, ambition, and the irresistible temptation to pretend you were born a little higher than you were. The bishop rubs his eyes with thumb and forefinger, as if he could erase the fatigue settling behind them. Proceed, he mutters, and the clerk, with the air of a man who's been waiting all evening for a good scandal, unrolls the next parchment. Petition for annulment due to deception of lineage and misrepresentation of noble birth. You can almost feel the air sharpen with interest.
Class and scandal, the church's favourite cocktail. Two figures step forward, the husband, thin and carefully dressed, wearing a tunic that looks just a bit too fine for him, and the wife, noble in every gesture, but pale with embarrassment. Her veil is flawless, her jewellery tasteful, but her hands tremble ever so slightly. The bishop gestures toward the man. You claim noble heritage. The man bows low. Indeed, Your Grace, my father was Sir Geoffroy of Lyon, knighted by the Duke himself. I was raised among men of honour. The wife speaks quickly, her tone clipped. He told me he was heir to an estate, that he had servants, land, a name of standing. When the truth came, I found I had married a common clerk who borrowed his lord's seal to impress me. The bishop leans back, unimpressed. Is this true? The man hesitates. I may have embroidered the truth. A muffled laugh ripples through the benches. You lied, the bishop corrects. The man shrugs, his voice soft. Only until I could make it true. There it is, the kind of hopelessly human defence you hear across every century. Historians still debate how seriously these deceptions were treated. In medieval Europe, lineage was currency, and a false claim of nobility wasn't just embarrassing, it was legally dangerous. Marriages depended on status, dowries, alliances. To misrepresent yourself was to commit fraud on both love and law. And yet there's something almost charming about it in a tragic way. The bishop drums his fingers. You wooed her under false pretense, knowing her family would not consent otherwise? Yes, Your Grace, the man admits. But I loved her honestly. The wife turns sharply. Honesty would have been poverty and truth from the start. He flinches. Would you have looked at me if I'd shown you both? Her silence is answer enough. The bishop sighs. And since your marriage? She lifts her chin. We lived in a small house by the market. He told me his estate was under repair. When I asked to visit, he said the bridge was out. There was no bridge, Your Grace. There was no estate. Even the bishop cracks a faint smile. A convenient flood. The husband looks down. I meant to rise high enough to deserve her, by work, by service. But my lies outpaced my fortune. You can almost hear the pity stir in the bishop's voice. And so you traded truth for time. He nods. And lost both. Historians still argue whether the Church's obsession with lineage was moral or material. Some bishops claimed it preserved social order, God's hierarchy reflected in human marriages. Others quietly admitted it kept the wealthy from mixing with those who worked for them. Either way, deception of rank was a mortal sin in velvet clothing. There's a famous case from Venice in 1511. A sailor named Pietro claimed to be a fallen nobleman and married the daughter of a silk merchant. When his true origins were revealed, the marriage was annulled for fraud in esteem. The bishop who ruled it reportedly sighed. He wished to be noble, and now he is in his suffering. You can almost imagine the same phrase being written here. The bishop leans forward, his tone softening. Lady, do you seek annulment out of anger or shame? Her eyes flash. Out of freedom, Your Grace.
I was wed to a ghost of his own invention. And you, sir? Do you contest it? He shakes his head slowly. No, the lie was mine. Let the truth be hers. The courtroom is quiet now. Even the clerk seems subdued. The bishop speaks carefully, each word deliberate. The Church declares this union null, as it was founded in deception. But remember this, titles fade faster than love, and both weigh less than the truth you traded for them. The man bows his head. Then I will live as what I am, a clerk who once pretended to be a knight. The bishop nods. A humbler title, perhaps a holier one. Historians still debate whether rulings like this were merciful or moralizing, but for once this feels less like punishment and more like closure. The wife leaves with her head high. The husband lingers a moment longer, staring at the floor as though the echo of his false name might still follow him home. As the doors close, the bishop leans back, muttering, If lies could be taxed, the Church would never lack gold. The clerk smirks faintly, then straightens another parchment. Petition, he announces, for annulment due to mistaken identity at the altar. The bishop freezes. Mistaken identity? Yes, Your Grace. The bride claims she married the wrong man. The bishop blinks twice, then flatly. Of course she does. You can't help smiling, because this sounds like the kind of story that will outlive parchment entirely. The bishop looks skyward for a brief, exasperated prayer, something halfway between Lord, give me strength and why me, before gesturing for the clerk to read. The clerk, trying not to smile, clears his throat and begins. Petition for annulment due to mistaken identity at the altar. The bride claims the man she married was not the man she intended, nor the man previously promised to her. A wave of murmurs sweeps through the courtroom like the tide washing over stones. Even the bishop has to pause before speaking. She married the wrong man? The clerk nods, expression studiously neutral. That is her claim. Very well, the bishop says at last. Bring her forward, and bring the alleged husband too, both of them. The doors open, and the couple steps forward, or perhaps the accident steps forward. The bride looks mortified, her veil trembling as though it would rather vanish than face this room. The man beside her looks equally embarrassed, his hat twisting in his hands. Behind them, another man stands near the benches, glaring, tall, dark-haired, and very clearly not the groom. The bishop folds his hands. Explain yourselves. The bride speaks first, her voice quivering but clear. Your Grace, I was meant to marry John of Arles, a cooper, but on the morning of the ceremony, his cousin, also named John, came in his place, wearing the same coat, standing in the same spot. I was nervous, the veil was thick, and I said the vows before I realized it wasn't him. The courtroom erupts in laughter. The bishop slams his palm on the desk. Silence! He looks back at her. You're telling me you married a man you didn't recognize until after the ceremony? Yes, Your Grace. I didn't lift the veil until the blessing was done.
When I did. She glances toward the benches where the real John sits fuming. It was not the man I loved. The bishop massages his temples. And you? He says to the accidental groom. The man bows awkwardly. I thought she knew, Your Grace. My cousin asked me to stand in his place at the procession because he was delayed. He said, stand near the altar, keep my spot. And then, well, the priest began, and she looked right at me and smiled, and I thought, perhaps this is Providence. You nearly choke, holding back laughter. The bishop, however, is not amused. So you knowingly took vows meant for another man? The stand-in fumbles for words. I didn't expect her to actually say yes. A fresh ripple of laughter breaks through before the bishop's glare snuffs it out again. Historians still debate whether these cases were genuine mistakes or elaborate ruses. In an era of identical names, veils, and chaotic parish ceremonies, mix-ups weren't impossible, but they were convenient. And sometimes they were planned. One infamous case from 1427 tells of two sisters marrying on the same day. In the confusion of candles and veils, the grooms approached the wrong brides. The priest, unaware, blessed both unions. When the error was discovered later that night, the couples petitioned for annulment. The bishop declared with dry humour, God may forgive confusion, but not indecision. The record ends with the note that the sisters switched husbands and lived contentedly ever after. But not every story ended so tidily. In Milan, a young noblewoman claimed she'd been deceived by a servant who disguised himself as her betrothed to gain her dowry. When caught, he argued that she had freely spoken her vows. The church ruled the marriage void, but the woman was forced to enter a convent for the preservation of her dignity. The man was executed. You can sense that this bishop, weary and pragmatic, intends to land somewhere in the middle. He leans forward. Did you share a home? The mistaken husband flushes. For 3 days, until the true John returned. He was displeased. Displeased? The bishop repeats. He broke my door, the man mutters. The bishop sighs. And you, sir, he says to the true groom, why did you not appear for your own wedding? The man straightens. My cart broke on the bridge, Your Grace. I ran as fast as I could, but by the time I arrived, the priest had already said, I now pronounce you husband and wife. I thought it better to sort it afterward than ruin the sacrament. The bishop stares at him. A noble thought. Utterly disastrous, but noble. He looks back to the bride. And you, how long did it take you to realize the error? She hesitates. When he kissed me? A single chuckle escapes someone in the back. The bishop doesn't even bother to scold this time. Historians still debate how medieval courts treated mistaken marriages. Canon law stated that consent made the marriage, but only if that consent was given to the correct person. Identity mattered, though witnesses often blurred the truth. Some argued that intent was everything. Others claimed that a spoken vow, however misdirected, still bound the soul. You can almost see the bishop weighing both doctrines like stones in his hands. Finally, he speaks. This union is null. The vows were spoken in error and without true intent. The woman shall be restored to her betrothed, and this unfortunate man released from the burden of being someone else. The relief in the room is palpable. Even the accidental husband exhales, looking as if a weight has been lifted off his very surname. The bishop adds with a weary smile, "Let this be a lesson to every man and woman under heaven. Look closely before you promise eternity." The crowd chuckles softly, grateful for the humor after hours of tension. The true groom steps forward, kneeling before the bishop. "Your Grace, may we be wed anew?" The bishop nods. "By all means, but I suggest you both keep your veils lifted this time." Laughter breaks loose again, and even the bishop allows himself a tired smile. Historians still quote this case as one of the rare examples where justice and comedy briefly held hands. A marriage unmade not by cruelty or sin, but by pure, spectacular confusion. The clerk scribbles down the verdict, his quill scratching like soft laughter across parchment. When he finishes, he reaches for the next scroll, still grinning faintly. "Petition," he announces, "for annulment due to prolonged absence of affection, specifically that the parties have lived as strangers beneath one roof." The bishop exhales through his nose. "Ah," he says, "the quietest tragedy of them all. You feel it, too, the sudden shift from farce to melancholy. Because this next one won't be about scandal or superstition. It will be about silence." The laughter fades and the courtroom grows still again, still enough that you can hear the faint hiss of the candles and the shuffle of someone's boot against stone. The bishop straightens, face unreadable. He gestures for the clerk to read, though his voice sounds almost reluctant, as if he already knows this case won't bring the grim satisfaction of judgment, just quiet, weary sadness. Petition for annulment due to prolonged absence of affection and mutual estrangement. The parties have lived together in name only, as strangers under one roof. No gasps this time, no snickers. Only a long silence that seems to thicken the air. Because everyone here knows that silence, that particular, invisible ruin. The couple before the court looks ordinary, too ordinary, not angry, not afraid, just empty. The husband, a tradesman with kind eyes dulled by habit, stands with hands clasped in front of him. The wife, pale and calm, keeps her gaze fixed on the floor. They could be anyone. The bishop speaks softly. "You seek annulment because there is no love." The husband hesitates. "Not only that, Your Grace, because there is nothing at all." A murmur moves through the benches, sympathy, maybe recognition. The bishop folds his hands. The church does not dissolve marriages for lack of warmth. You must give cause. The wife lifts her head, and her voice, though steady, carries the faint tremor of something long suppressed. "We have lived 10 years beneath the same roof. We share no bed, no word, no prayer. He eats in silence. I sleep alone. We are ghosts who wear rings." Her husband doesn't argue. "I do not hate her, Your Grace," he says quietly, "but I do not know her either. It is as if we never met." The bishop's expression softens. "Did you marry by arrangement?" He nods. "Our families believed it wise. I was young, she was younger." "And no cause of separation? No cruelty? No sin?" "No, Your Grace," she says. "Only nothing." The bishop leans back. "Nothing," he repeats. "A harder reason than hatred." You feel it too, that peculiar ache of boredom elevated to tragedy. Historians still debate whether courts ever granted annulments for emotional barrenness. The Church, built on rules and sacraments, couldn't comprehend something as shapeless as silence. But records show faint traces of these petitions, phrases like marriage without affection, union without comfort, companionship turned to ash. Most were denied, some, rarely, were granted, if the bishop was old enough to understand what years of quiet despair can do to a soul. The wife speaks again, her voice soft but sharp with truth. I have prayed for love to return, but prayers are wasted on an empty table. When he looks at me, it is as one might look at the wall. The bishop turns to the husband. And you? The man sighs. She is not wrong. I work, I eat, I sleep. I feel no sin, only stillness. The bishop nods slowly. There are many prisons, he murmurs, walls, vows, and sometimes silence itself. He studies them both for a long moment. Do you seek freedom to love another? The wife shakes her head. No, I seek freedom to feel alive again. The husband bows slightly. If she finds joy, let her take it. I would not hold her. It's the simplest exchange of the night and somehow the most painful. The bishop looks down at the parchment, his quill hovering. Canon law does not speak of absence as sin, he says quietly. But it also does not speak of love as law. I cannot unmake what heaven joined, but I can permit you to live apart in peace. She nods. Then let peace be something. He signs the decree, not annulment, not dissolution, but separation of bed and board. A strange, melancholy halfway house between marriage and freedom. Historians still debate whether such rulings were acts of compassion or cowardice. But for couples like this, perhaps it didn't matter. The Church couldn't untangle their silence, only acknowledge it. The husband bows. Thank you, Your Grace. The wife curtsies faintly, her eyes dry. I will pray for him, she says softly. Pray for yourself as well, the bishop replies almost gently. As they leave, their footsteps echo, measured even and somehow lonelier for it. The bishop sits back, exhaling through his teeth. Love dies quieter than sin, he mutters. The clerk glances up. Shall I read the next petition, Your Grace? He nods. Petition for annulment based on incompatibility of temperament and ceaseless quarrelling. The bishop lets out a long, theatrical groan. Ah, from silence to shouting. God, you do test me. You can almost smile at the shift. The next one won't be about ghosts in a quiet house. It'll be about fire, fury, and the kind of noise that shakes the stained glass. The bishop sighs so deeply it's almost a prayer. Proceed, he murmurs, and the clerk, clearly refreshed by the promise of drama, unrolls the parchment with a little too much enthusiasm. Petition for annulment based on incompatibility of temperament, ceaseless quarrelling, and mutual refusal to live in peace. Ah, yes. From silence to shouting, the pendulum swings again. The doors open, and the couple strides in like combatants entering an arena. They don't wait to be addressed. Even before the clerk finishes reading, they're already snapping at each other under their breath. The husband, a stocky man with a scar on his cheek, scowls at his wife like he's been preparing for this moment all year. The wife, tall, sharp-eyed, unyielding, stares straight ahead, refusing to look at him. The bishop glances heavenward. Lord, grant me patience, he mutters, and a very long nap. Then in a louder voice, You are Thomas and Eleanor of Bristol? The husband nods stiffly. Yes, Your Grace. The wife's reply comes like an arrow. For now. The bishop rubs his temples. Let us begin. Who brings the petition? I do, Eleanor says. I wish the marriage annulled on account of his cruelty, obstinacy, and general unsuitability for human company. Thomas's eyes widen. Cruelty. Your Grace, she once threw a candlestick at me. After you called me a serpent. You hissed at me. The bishop raises a hand. Enough. This is not a tavern quarrel. You stand before God's court. They both fall silent, but only briefly. Historians still debate whether cases like this were ever granted. Technically, incompatibility was not a valid ground for annulment in medieval canon law. Marriage was meant to be permanent, an endurance test of virtue, but bishops, being human, often preferred domestic peace to divine rigidity. So when a couple's hatred grew loud enough to rattle the parish windows, the church sometimes looked for loopholes. Cruelty, mental disturbance, failure of Christian duty, anything to label a war as theology. The bishop sighs. Tell me plainly, when did this discord begin? Eleanor crosses her arms. The moment I realized he keeps every penny he earns locked in a chest I am forbidden to touch. Thomas glares. Because every time I trust you with coin, it turns into ribbons and perfumes. I was trying to smell like someone you might actually notice. He turns red. You see what I endure, Your Grace? The bishop closes his eyes. I see two people who confuse marriage with combat. He looks to the clerk. Record that both parties admit mutual provocation. The clerk nods, scribbling furiously. Eleanor leans forward. He tells everyone at the tavern that I poisoned his soup. Thomas throws up his hands. It was green, Eleanor. It was herbs for your digestion. Then why did the dog refuse to eat it? The bishop slams his hand on the armrest. Enough! Both of you, enough! The silence that follows is fragile, like glass cooling too fast. Do you still share a home? He asks. Barely, Eleanor says. I sleep in the upper room. He sleeps by the hearth so he can whisper to his money chest. Thomas mutters. At least it doesn't argue back. The bishop exhales. And you seek annulment, not separation? Eleanor nods. I want the bond gone. Want the bond. We were never truly one flesh, only two sharp stones striking sparks. The bishop glances at Thomas. And you? The man shrugs. I'll not keep what she despises. Let her go if she'll stop cursing my meals. You can't help but feel a strange fondness for them both. There's no malice here, just the exhaustion of two people who mistook proximity for destiny. Historians still argue whether these stories reveal moral decay or ordinary humanity. Some say the Church's refusal to recognize incompatibility as cause for annulment kept thousands trapped in bitterness. Others argue it forced people to learn patience, humility, and, eventually, resignation. Either way, these courts were where passion went to be translated into Latin. The bishop sighs. Marriage is not a bond of pleasure, but of endurance. Yet God does not ask that endurance become cruelty. It is clear that peace cannot live between you. Eleanor looks up sharply. Then I am free. He shakes his head. Not free, but released from the same roof. Separation of bed and board as before. Her face falls. So I must remain his wife in name? Yes, the bishop says softly. In name, but not in torment. Thomas nods slowly. That's enough for me. It's the closest thing to agreement they've had in years. The bishop leans back. Let it be written, this marriage stands in law, but not in life. The parties may live apart in peace, and may they both learn silence again. Eleanor gives a dry laugh. If silence is peace, I'll embrace it gladly. Then you are wiser than most, the bishop replies. Historians still record such verdicts as partial dissolutions. They solved nothing, but soothed everything, at least on parchment. The couple depart separately, their footsteps echoing like mismatched bells. When the door shuts, the bishop leans forward and mutters, God save us from the living. The clerk clears his throat. Next petition, Your Grace. The bishop groans. Tell me it's not another marital duel. The clerk squints at the parchment. "No, Your Grace. This one is unusual." He hesitates, then reads aloud. "Petition for annulment on grounds of marriage to a corpse, contracted in ignorance of the spouse's prior death." The bishop blinks. The crowd stirs. You feel your heart skip once. "Oh, for heaven's sake," the bishop mutters. "Now we've married the dead." He straightens his robes and glares at the clerk. "Very well," he sighs. "Let the record show that tonight has truly gone to hell." And you, sitting there in the flickering glow, can't help but lean forward, because this next case isn't about deceit, pride, or even sin. It's about the strangest marriage of all, one that death forgot to cancel. The hall has grown so still you can hear the wax dripping from the candles. Even the bishop, jaded and grey from years of absurd petitions, looks unsettled. He presses his palm flat against the desk, as though grounding himself in something solid before stepping into this next abyss of human absurdity. The clerk clears his throat, the paper in his trembling hands. Petition for annulment on the grounds that the marriage was contracted in ignorance of the spouse's prior death. A nervous ripple passes through the room, half curiosity, half horror. Someone in the back mutters a prayer. The bishop says quietly, "Bring forth the petitioner." A woman steps forward, veiled in deep black. Her posture is fragile but unbroken, her movements deliberate, as if every step has been practiced. She carries no jewelry, no embroidery, just grief. The bishop's tone softens. "Your name, child?" "Isabel of Rouen, Your Grace." "And your husband?" She hesitates. "Jean, though he is no longer." The bishop leans back, steepling his fingers. "Explain to this court how such a remarkable union came to pass." Isabel takes a trembling breath. "My betrothed, Jean, was a soldier. He was sent to fight in the northern wars. Word came that he'd fallen in battle. My family arranged a match with another man, Pierre of Amiens, a friend of my father's. I obeyed." The bishop nods slowly. "Go on." Her voice tightens. "But the night before the ceremony, my father received new word that Jean still lived. The messenger arrived too late. The vows were spoken the next morning. And by evening—" She pauses. Jean's body was returned after all. He had died 3 days before the wedding. The courtroom remains absolutely silent. Even the clerk forgets to write. You can feel the chill settle over everything, the quiet horror of a marriage that had already crossed the line between life and death before the bride even knew. The bishop's expression softens. "And your husband, Pierre, he knew of this?" She nods. "He did, but too late. When the coffin came, he said the vows must be annulled. He claimed it was a curse, that I had wed in death's shadow and brought misfortune to his house." "Has he abandoned you?" "Yes, Your Grace. He says the grave still binds me." The bishop exhales slowly. Superstition runs deeper than scripture. Historians still argue about such cases, whether they were sincere or contrived, rooted in faith or fear. In medieval Europe, death was never far from the altar. Plague, war, famine, all could strike between betrothal and ceremony. If a spouse died before vows were spoken, the contract was void. But if the death went unknown until after, the church faced an impossible paradox: how to untangle a marriage made half to the living, half to the dead. The bishop looks at her gently. "Do you still wear his ring?" She glances down. "Both," she admits, lifting her trembling hand. 2 thin bands glint, one gold, one dull and bent. The bishop studies her a moment longer, then asks, "And what do you wish from this court?" Her answer is simple, hauntingly so. to be among the living again. It's not greed or guilt or sin, just a plea to rejoin the world. The bishop turns to the clerk. Has the church addressed such a case before? The clerk hesitates. There are precedents, Your Grace. The Council of Rheims ruled that a woman married in ignorance of her husband's death remains innocent, but must seek annulment before taking another. The bishop nods. Then we follow that mercy. He looks back to Isabel. You are blameless, child. The union is annulled, and your conscience clear. No curse follows you. Her shoulders sag as though the air itself has been restored to her lungs. Thank you, Your Grace. The bishop adds softly, As for the one who left you, let him pray for forgiveness. Fear is a poor substitute for faith. The clerk begins to write, but his hand hesitates as Isabel speaks again. May I keep both rings? The bishop tilts his head. For what purpose? To remember, she says, that I once loved two men, the living and the dead. He studies her face, perhaps looking for superstition, perhaps seeing only humanity. Keep them, he says finally. But where only one? Historians still discuss this case, not for its absurdity, but for its tenderness. It became something of a parable. The woman between two worlds, released not by exorcism or penance, but by recognition. The bishop signs the decree and pushes it toward the clerk. Let the record show, he says quietly, that death voids the contract, but not the heart. The crowd exhales as she leaves, a dark silhouette moving through the golden haze of candlelight, a living ghost finally unburdened. For a long moment after she's gone, no one speaks. Even the bishop seems unwilling to disturb the air she's left behind. Then, with a weary sigh, he waves for the next parchment. The clerk looks uncertain. Your Grace, this one comes from the archives of Normandy. A strange one. The petitioner claims marriage to an inanimate object, a relic. The bishop blinks. The silence stretches. Then, dryly, of course she does. A few snickers ripple through the room. You can feel the bishop's exhaustion shift into something darker, a kind of grim amusement that only comes from seeing too much. Read it, he says. Let us see how deep human folly can dig. And as the clerk begins, you can almost see it forming, the next absurd chapter in this endless parade of strange unions. A woman perhaps in love not with a man, but with an idea carved in stone. The bishop pinches the bridge of his nose and mutters something in Latin that sounds suspiciously like, "Deliver me from madness." But there's no escape now. The clerk, visibly suppressing a grin, unrolls the parchment and begins to read. Petition for annulment due to unlawful spiritual union, specifically the marriage of a woman to a sacred relic undertaken in symbolic devotion. The crowd stirs like bees in a shaken hive. A few gasp, others smirk. One old woman crosses herself so vigorously you fear she might sprain a shoulder. The bishop looks up slowly. She married what exactly? The clerk glances at the document. A reliquary containing, it is said, a fragment of St. Martin's rib. The bishop blinks once, then twice. A rib. She married a rib. Yes, Your Grace, the clerk says helpfully, though her letter refers to it as my eternal bridegroom. The bishop shuts his eyes. Bring her in. The doors creak open, and the petitioner enters. She's not what you expect. Not young, not mad-eyed or wild-haired. She's a woman of perhaps 30, composed, serene, her linen veil spotless. Her gaze is calm, too calm, as though she's already decided she's in the right, and everyone else will eventually agree. The bishop clears his throat. You are Marie of Lisieux? Yes, Your Grace. You have bound yourself to a relic of St. Martin? She nods serenely. In spirit and vow. The bishop's tone hardens. You understand, I hope, that relics are not men. Her lips curve faintly. Then the men I have known were not saints. A ripple of laughter bursts through the benches before the bishop's glare crushes it flat. He folds his hands. Tell this court exactly what occurred. Marie takes a deep breath. After years of prayer and solitude, I felt called to devote myself wholly to the church. I asked my confessor whether I might become a bride of Christ. He said the convents were full and my dowry too small, so I made my own vow to St. Martin, who has always been my protector. I placed the relic upon my finger as one would a ring, and pledged myself to purity and service. The bishop massages his temples. And who officiated this union? No one, Your Grace, only God was witness. The clerk tries and fails to keep a straight face. The bishop sighs deeply. Madam, you do realize that marriage is a sacrament between persons. The Church does not, indeed, cannot recognize marriage to a fragment of bone, however blessed. Her chin lifts, but saints are not dead. Their spirits live in heaven. And your rib, he says dryly, remains in a gilded box. She looks unshaken. My love is not carnal, it is divine. I am joined to holiness, not flesh. You can almost admire her conviction, almost. Historians still debate whether cases like this reflected devotion, delusion, or quiet rebellion. Throughout the Middle Ages, some women, especially those denied entry into convents, declared spiritual marriages to Christ or the saints. Most were harmless mystics. A few, like Marie, took things alarmingly literally. To them, the Church's bureaucracy was just another suitor to reject. The bishop leans forward, voice gentler now. Child, you need no annulment. There was no marriage. What you did was misguided devotion, not sacrilege. But the parish priest called it blasphemy, she says quietly. He said I mocked the holy rites. Perhaps you confused them, the bishop says. But mockery requires malice, and I see none in you. She nods, relieved. Then I may remain pledged? As a servant of faith, yes. As a wife to a relic, no. The faintest smile touches her lips. Then I am widowed, for heaven's sake. Another ripple of laughter, softer this time, almost affectionate. Even the bishop allows himself a tired smile. Historians still argue whether this ruling was lenient or shrewd. By treating her as misguided rather than heretical, the bishop avoided scandal and protected the dignity of her faith. It became one of the more famous cases of pious confusion, cited centuries later by theologians trying to explain the difference between spiritual zeal and ecclesiastical paperwork. The bishop signs the decree. Let it be written, her act was not marriage but vow. The union is null by reason of non-existence. Marie bows gracefully. Thank you, Your Grace. I shall continue to serve St. Martin chastely. I suspect, the bishop says dryly, you will find that quite easy. She departs with quiet dignity, the faint scent of rose oil trailing behind her like a benediction. When the doors close, the bishop leans back and stares at the ceiling. Dear Lord, he murmurs, when I took holy orders, I imagined sermons and psalms. Instead, you send me ribs, corpses, and endless fools. The clerk hides a grin and lifts the next parchment. Your Grace, he says carefully, this one is somewhat connected. Connected? The bishop groans. Yes, the clerk says. Petition for annulment on grounds that the wife has taken vows of perpetual chastity after marriage and refuses the marital bed. The bishop blinks, then lets out his slow, defeated laugh. Oh, splendid, the living nun. You can't help but grin. From saints' bones to celibate wives, this next case promises to blend piety and provocation in the finest medieval fashion. The bishop adjusts his seat with a weary creak the wood beneath him groaning like an old friend that's heard one story too many. He gestures for the clerk to proceed, though there's a flicker of wry amusement in his tired eyes. The clerk clears his throat. Petition for annulment based on spiritual incompatibility. The wife has taken private vows of perpetual chastity after marriage and refuses the marital bed. A low hum ripples through the hall. It's not quite scandal, more like the thrill of gossip wrapped in piety. The bishop sighs. Bring them forward. A man and woman step out of the shadows. He looks bewildered and bruised by confusion rather than anger. She looks serene, radiant even, dressed in white, with a small wooden cross around her neck. She moves with the composure of someone already halfway to sainthood and entirely uninterested in turning back. The bishop studies them both. You are Jacques and Beatrice of Caen? Yes, Your Grace, the husband says, voice tense. The wife bows her head slightly. Yes. The bishop steeples his fingers. And you, madam, have taken a vow of chastity after marriage? Yes, Your Grace, to give my body and spirit wholly to God. The husband spreads his hands helplessly. And left nothing for me. The bishop gives him a look that says not now. Turning back to her, he asks, Were you compelled? No, Your Grace, she says softly. I heard the calling. The priest refused me entry to the convent because I am wed. So I made my vows privately before God. And your husband? I informed him that night, she replies evenly. He took it poorly. Jacques steps forward. Poorly? I thought she'd lost her wits. We'd been married 2 years. She woke one morning, said she'd had a vision of St. Agnes, and that from that moment she would belong only to heaven. I thought perhaps it would pass. Beatrice looks at him calmly. It did not. The bishop exhales, rubbing his forehead. And since then? She sleeps in the guest room, Jacques says bitterly. She fasts, prays, and keeps the door barred. She says my touch would profane her vow. Beatrice bows her head. He has his trade. I have my soul. You can almost feel the bishop's pity war with his exasperation. Historians still debate how often this happened, wives or husbands who, mid-marriage, declared themselves spiritually wed to Christ and withdrew from physical life. In theory, the Church revered such chastity. In practice, it caused chaos. Some bishops called it saintly, others called it abandonment. The line between holiness and hubris was thin and, in dim candlelight, easy to cross. The bishop leans forward. Beatrice, you must understand, marriage is itself a holy vow. You cannot unmake one promise to God by inventing another. She meets his gaze without fear. But can I not love God more than man? The bishop hesitates. Yes, but not less honestly. You promised to share your life with him, not to vanish into prayer. Jacques looks at her desperately. I never asked her to worship me, Your Grace, only to speak to me, to smile, to see me. Beatrice's face softens for the first time. You are kind, Jacques, but the world feels dim now. The closer I draw to God, the further everything else fades. It's not defiance, it's conviction. That's what makes it worse. The bishop closes his eyes for a moment. You seek annulment? Yes, Your Grace, Jacques says quickly. If she belongs to heaven, let heaven have her. I'll not wrestle angels for affection. The bishop nods slowly. And you, child? Do you wish to remain his wife? No, Beatrice whispers, but I will pray for him every day of my life. That line, you know, will find its way into a sermon somewhere. Historians still argue about this particular verdict, one of the few where personal faith clashed headlong with institutional order. Some saw it as rebellion, others as a kind of tragic grace. The bishop straightens. Marriage is a covenant, not a contract of convenience. But when one partner renounces the world entirely, the bond ceases to live in its purpose. He takes up his quill and writes with slow, deliberate strokes. The union is annulled by reason of spiritual incompatibility. The wife is released to live in chastity. The husband may remarry if he so chooses. Jacques bows, half in gratitude, half in disbelief. Thank you, Your Grace. Though I'd prefer my next wife to sleep less with saints and more with me. The courtroom ripples with laughter before the bishop's stern gaze quiets it again. He turns to Beatrice. Go and keep your vows with humility. Pride, even holy pride, is sin in disguise. She bows deeply. I will remember, Your Grace. And as she leaves, you can't help noticing that she doesn't look triumphant, only peaceful. When the door closes behind her, the bishop exhales. We have now annulled love, death, deception, and piety itself, he says. What remains? The clerk scans the next parchment, hesitating. This one is difficult to categorize. The bishop groans, or of course it is. The clerk clears his throat and reads, Petition for annulment on account of monstrous birth. The wife gave issue to a creature not of human likeness, and the husband declares the union accursed. The hall gasps. Even the bishop, hardened as he is, goes still. You feel your breath catch, because this is no longer the theatre of absurdity. This is the edge where fear, faith, and ignorance all meet under the flicker of a candle flame. The bishop's hand freezes halfway to his face. For a long, brittle moment, the only sound in the courtroom is the faint hiss of candle wax and the uneasy shuffle of a boot against stone. He lowers his hand slowly. Read that again, he says. The clerk swallows. Petition for annulment on account of monstrous birth. The wife gave issue to a creature not of human likeness, and the husband declares the union accursed. The word monstrous seems to curdle the air itself. The crowd murmurs in horror and fascination. The bishop's voice turns low and careful. Bring them forward. The doors open. The husband enters first, a gaunt, wide-eyed man clutching a rosary so tightly the beads leave dents in his fingers. Behind him, the wife follows, pale and trembling, her shawl pulled tight as though to shield herself from 1,000 invisible stones. You can feel it instantly, the atmosphere of dread that follows a whisper turned into law. The bishop studies them quietly. Your names? Henri and Aveline of Poitiers, the man says. The bishop nods. You claim your child is not of human form? Henry's voice cracks. Not a child, Your Grace. A beast, born with claws, no eyes, and a cry that curdled the milk in the house. I sent for a priest. He refused to baptize it. He said no soul could dwell in such a thing. Aveline flinches. It was our child, she cries suddenly. It breathed, it wept, and before dawn it was gone. The courtroom falls silent again. The bishop's gaze lingers on her. Gone? They buried it, she whispers, without me. Henry's voice hardens. It was no child of mine. No man's seed makes such a creature. I have lived righteous. I have prayed. Only sin makes monsters. You feel the air tighten, centuries of superstition collapsing into one moment of helpless cruelty. The bishop folds his hands, eyes closing briefly. And you seek annulment on that ground? Yes, Your Grace. She brought corruption into my house. She consorted with something unholy. The midwife saw it too. The babe bore teeth. Aveline lets out a sob. It was born too soon, deformed by nature, not demons. The bishop's eyes open, calm but grave. And yet the priest refused baptism? Henri nods. He said it had no soul. Historians still argue about these cases where religion met biology and ignorance met terror. Deformities, premature births, stillborn children, all were interpreted through the lens of sin and punishment. A child born strange could unravel an entire household, its mother suddenly accused of witchcraft or adultery with the devil. Some bishops condemned, a few braver ones defended. None walked away untouched. The bishop leans forward. Aveline, do you swear before God that you were faithful to your husband? She presses her shaking hands together. I swear it, Your Grace. I have never known another. Henri's voice cuts like a blade. Then how do you explain what you bore? She meets his gaze through tears. Because not every sorrow is a curse, Henri. Sometimes nature is cruel without reason. That line hangs in the air, unanswerable. The bishop turns to the clerk. Has the midwife given statement? The clerk nods reluctantly. She did, Your Grace. She described the child as small, twisted, but human. She said fear made the others see what they wanted to see. A murmur ripples through the court, doubt creeping in like light under a door. The bishop's tone sharpens. Then the priest who denied baptism acted in ignorance. It is not for man to decide which bodies are worthy of souls. He turns to Henri. Your fear is human, but your accusation is sin. You sought to wash your grief in her guilt. Henri's face hardens. You would have me live with a woman touched by darkness? The bishop's eyes flash. You live with one touched by sorrow, and that, sir, is holier than you know. The room goes very still. Historians still debate this moment, the rare instance where compassion outweighed superstition. It's said that the bishop's words were recorded by a young scribe who later became a physician, inspired to seek truth in medicine rather than in fear. The bishop takes up his quill. This union stands, he declares. No annulment shall be granted. The child's death was tragedy, not proof. You will both atone, not for birth, but for blame. And if you cannot share a roof, you will at least share prayer. Aveline collapses into silent tears. Henri says nothing, jaw clenched tight, eyes fixed on the floor. The bishop sets down his pen. Let it be written, he says softly, that ignorance is the cruelest midwife of all. The clerk hesitates, then writes the words exactly. The crowd disperses slowly, shaken. You watch as Aveline is led away, her shoulders bowed but her dignity intact. Henri lingers behind, hollow-eyed, as if seeing his guilt for the first time. When the door closes, the bishop leans back, rubbing his face. We've annulled joy, hope, and now even grief, he murmurs. Is there anything left? The clerk clears his throat. One final case, Your Grace. It's the last petition of the night. The bishop exhales heavily. Then let it be merciful. The clerk hesitates, then reads, Petition for annulment on grounds that the husband vanished for 7 years and returned believing himself another man. The bishop's head lifts slowly. Another man? Yes, Your Grace. He claims to be reborn and refuses his own name. The bishop stares blankly for a long moment. Then, with a faint, incredulous smile, he mutters, Well, it seems even death has competition. You can't help leaning forward. Because this last case, this one sounds less like a judgment and more like the edge of myth itself. The bishop looks older now, his eyes ringed with shadow, his patience worn thin as candle stubs at dawn. But when the clerk reads the final petition, even he sits upright again. Something in the phrasing, a man returned as another self, has pried open his curiosity one last time. Petition for annulment, the clerk reads carefully, on the grounds that the husband, presumed dead for 7 years, returned claiming to be another man, disavowing all former ties, including his marriage. The murmurs begin immediately. The words returned from death always awaken a primitive awe, half faith, half fear. The bishop exhales. Bring them forward. The great doors open for the final time tonight. The wife enters first, her face lined, her eyes hollow from years of waiting. She holds herself upright by will alone, her hands clasped tight in front of her. Behind her follows the man. His gait is slow, deliberate, almost cautious. His beard is overgrown, his hair streaked with white. But his face, though gaunt, is unmistakably that of the man she once called husband. And yet, there's something different about him. His eyes do not recognize the room or the woman. He stands like a stranger among ghosts. The bishop studies him closely. "You are Etienne of Tours?" "I was," the man says softly. His voice is low and even, with an unsettling calm. "Once." The bishop frowns. "Once?" "I am not who I was," he replies. "That man died on the road between Rouen and Calais. The sea took him, and what returned was another." His wife's voice breaks. "He lies, Your Grace. He vanished when the storm struck. His ship was lost. I mourned him 7 years. When he came back, I ran to him, but he looked through me as if I were air." The bishop leans forward. "And yet here you stand, alive." The man nods. "Alive, yes, but not as him. I remember nothing of his life. The name, the vows, the house, empty echoes. I woke on a foreign shore with nothing but his face." You feel the bishop's skepticism waver, because this isn't a tale of deceit. It's too quiet for that, too haunting. Historians still argue about cases like this, strange and rare as comets. Amnesia, possession, survival trauma, all those modern terms didn't exist yet. To the medieval mind, a man who returned without memory of his soul was neither dead nor alive, but altered. The bishop folds his hands. "And you seek annulment?" The man nods once. "I do. That woman's husband is gone. I will not live under his name or sleep in his house." His wife's tears spill freely now. He speaks like a stranger, eats like one, prays like one. I tried to remind him, our wedding day, our child, our garden, but he calls them dreams of another life. I ask him to remember me, and he says, "You are kind, madam, but I was never yours." The bishop looks between them, weighing the scales of law and mystery. "Do you believe him mad?" he asks quietly. "I believe," she whispers, "that grief has stolen his memory. But memory is not the soul. My husband's body stands before me, and my heart knows him, even if his mind does not." It's the most heartbreakingly simple line of the night. The bishop's voice softens. "And you?" he asks the man. "Do you feel nothing when you look at her?" The man hesitates. "Only sorrow, the kind you feel for the dead." Historians still debate what was truly happening here. Some call it psychological dissociation, the mind's desperate trick to survive trauma. Others say these cases mirrored spiritual rebirth, where guilt or suffering forced a man to shed his identity like a snake's skin. The church, of course, saw it differently, as either miracle or madness. The bishop finally speaks, his tone both weary and reverent. "If the body returns but the spirit refuses its bonds, what then is marriage? Flesh alone does not make a husband." He glances at the clerk. "Has any ruling like this been given before?" The clerk flips through parchments nervously. "Is one, Your Grace?" "Normandy, year of our Lord 1281. A sailor lost at sea returned years later, claiming new baptism under another name. The bishop then declared the first life dead in spirit and granted the wife liberty to remarry." The bishop nods slowly. "Then so it shall be here." He turns back to the woman. "Your husband's soul, if not his body, has passed beyond your vows. You are released. This union, once holy, now rests in peace." The woman trembles. "And him?" The bishop looks at the man. He must live as who he claims to be. If he has truly died once, may he live the second life more kindly. The man bows.
I thank you, Your Grace. The woman turns away, shoulders shaking silently, and for a brief, unbearable moment, you can almost hear her heart breaking between footsteps. Historians still discuss this case with fascination. Some say the man was simply ill. Others whisper he'd committed a crime and found amnesia convenient. And a few, those who believe in stranger things, say perhaps he truly had died, and the soul that returned was not the one that left. When the doors close behind them, the bishop remains silent for a long time. The courtroom, emptied now, feels haunted by the echoes of all who've stood there, the deceivers, the dreamers, the desperate. At last, he exhales. So ends the ledger, he murmurs. 30 tales, 30 hearts, and not one left whole. He rises slowly, joints cracking, the weight of judgment heavy on his shoulders. He extinguishes a candle with his fingers, then another and another, until only one flame remains, a trembling gold reflected in his eyes. Love, he says softly, is the strangest heresy of all. The clerk packs the parchments away in silence. Outside, dawn has begun to bloom, pale and merciful. You let your eyes rest on that final candle, the one still burning long after reason has gone to sleep. The courtroom fades now, the stones cooling, the air settling, the echoes folding into silence. You picture the bishop alone, his breath slow, his thoughts drifting towards something softer than law. For all his sternness, he's human, tired of sin, tired of sorrow, tired of being the keeper of broken vows. Somewhere in that exhaustion, there's mercy. You imagine him stepping outside, the first light touching the horizon. The bells are quiet. The fields beyond the walls are misty and blue, like the surface of memory itself. The world, for a fleeting moment, feels clean again. And you, still there, half awake, half dreaming, feel the same calm begin to settle. Every strange marriage, every lost name, every tear-stained confession, all of it dissolves into that early light. The parchment is closed, the ink dried. No more petitions tonight, no more arguments with ghosts. Breathe slowly, let the air drift through you like the sound of a distant choir. Somewhere, someone still believes love can be measured by vows, by rules, by candles on a stone altar. But here, in this stillness, you know better. Love is not annulled.
It simply changes shape, softens, quiets, and folds itself into memory. The last candle flickers, guttering low. The bishop whispers a prayer, not for judgment, but for peace, and lets the flame die. The night sighs once, then closes its eyes. Sweet dreams,